Chapter 57:17. The moment the black lightning struck, the disciples of the everlasting pavilion who had been knocked down by Kang Shinmu were all turned into ashes. In the eyes of the spectators, this scene did not seem to be strange at all, and they did not have much of a reaction. However, Kang Shinmu and Emoya's expressions changed slightly. They did not expect that the everlasting pavilion would treat their defeated disciples like this. Gu Yangfeng's hand gesture did not stop. With a wave of his hand, more black lightning struck down from the sky. Several black lightning bolts covered Kang Shinmu and Emoya like a spider web. As the black lightning struck, Kang Shinmu sensed several different supreme divine powers. What a shocking supreme divine power! Emoya's beautiful eyes narrowed as she stared at the sweeping black lightning and said in a deep voice. Yes. Kang Shinmu was stunned. Why did this Gu Yangfeng possess more than 10 types of supreme divine powers? Kang Shinmu was confident that he possessed more than 10 types of supreme divine powers. It was the effect of the devouring power. Most importantly, even if he possessed so many supreme divine powers, he could not comprehend them all in a short period of time. To be precise, there were only 2 types of supreme divine powers that he could actually use. One was the power of the supreme divine fire. This was the first type of supreme divine power that he had comprehended. Now, he had already reached the 8th level and comprehended the power of the supreme realm. Next was the power of the supreme soul. This kind of supreme divine power was obtained through devouring. Currently, it had not improved much and had not comprehended the power of the supreme realm. There was also the power of the supreme sacred earth and the power of the supreme dark steel, which he only understood a little. He had only used a little of the power of the supreme dark steel, and he had not used the power of the supreme sacred earth. This Gu Yangfeng was actually able to use so many supreme divine powers at the same time. Kang Shinmu, let's go. Emoya's voice rang in his ears. Kang Shinmu calmed himself down and rushed in the direction that Emoya had pointed out. The black thunderbolt was very fast. However, Jiang Shenwu and Emoya were even faster. They easily dodged the black thunderbolt's attack. Senior, let's go out. As soon as Kang Shinmu's feet touched the ground, he sensed something strange in this space. Gu Yangfeng was setting up an array. His black lightning made use of more than 10 kinds of supreme divine powers to once again display the derivation formation that Kang Shinmu had just broken. Just as the derivation array formation appeared, Kang Shinmu and Emoya had already left this space. It was also at this time that Kang Shinmu found out what was going on with the dozen types of unparalleled godly powers. That was not Gu Yangfeng's supreme divine power, but the supreme divine power of the disciples of the everlasting pavilion that Gu Yangfeng had killed. The moment his black lightning struck, it deprived all the disciples of the everlasting pavilion of their supreme divine power. That was why he was able to create such a large-scale derivative formation all by himself. However, in the end, it was still the power of one person. Although he had the means to set up the formation, the speed at which he set up the formation was much slower. He still couldn't achieve his goal of trapping Kang Shinmu and Emoya. Seeing that the two of them had left the range of the current formation, Gu Yangfeng simply stopped setting up the formation. He condensed the current formation and took the initiative to activate it. The moment the formation was activated, a black vortex was formed. The black vortex spun fiercely, and a huge suction force came from it, sucking everything around the vortex. Kang Shinmu and Emoya were a certain distance away from the vortex, but they could still feel the strong suction force. They tried their best to circulate the power in their whole body to avoid being sucked in. Some of the cultivators around were not paying attention and were sucked into the black vortex. Get out of the way. At this time, a cultivator cried out in alarm. That's the corresponding secret technique of the everlasting pavilion's elders, the thunder vortex. No one knew who said it, but for a moment, the cultivators who were watching suddenly burst into an uproar and started talking about it. All the sects in the outer region knew that each of the elders of the everlasting pavilion of the 4 major sects had a corresponding secret technique. Elder Gu Yangfeng's secret technique was the thunder vortex. The thunder vortex could devour everything within its range. Everything that was devoured by the thunder vortex would be crushed by the power in the thunder vortex. Get out of here if you don't want to die. Guyangfeng coldly glanced at the surrounding cultivators and said in an awe-inspiring tone. As soon as he said that, many cultivators retreated. Even so, there were still some cultivators who were directly involved in it. The thunder vortex was still constantly spinning, and at the same time, a huge suction force came from it. The screams of the cultivators who were sucked in could be heard. Kang Xinmu and Mo Ya also heard what the surrounding cultivators said. The two of them did not stop and rushed to the side. However, what they did not expect was that Guyangfeng's secret technique, the thunder vortex, could actually move. Instead of saying that the thunder vortex could move, it was more accurate to say that Guyangfeng made the thunder vortex cross space. At this time, the thunder vortex had already blocked in front of Kang Xinmu and Mo Ya. The two of them were already locked by the suction force. Kang Xinmu, I will cover your retreat. Mo Ya's slender jade-like hands quickly formed a seal. Senior, this is the devouring power. I will cover you. After Kang Xinmu realized that the essence of the thunder vortex was the devouring power, he secretly made a decision in his heart. Mo Ya already knew what Kang Xinmu was trying to do. Kang Xinmu, you can't. Mo Ya frowned slightly. No one knew what was in the thunder vortex, and it was very dangerous to be sucked in just like that. Senior, don't worry. Kang Xinmu had made up his mind. Moreover, there was no longer any room for them to make a choice. Kang Xinmu concentrated all his energy around Mo Ya, and together with Mo Ya's supreme divine power, he sent Mo Ya out of the range of the thunder vortex. This also meant that Kang Xinmu had been sucked into the thunder vortex. Mo Ya, who was far away from the thunder vortex's devouring range, fixed her beautiful eyes on the thunder vortex. Heh, what an infatuated person. Seeing that Kang Xinmu was sacrificing himself in exchange for Mo Ya's freedom, Guyangfeng sneered. None of you can leave. Guyangfeng had no intention of letting Mo Ya go. He controlled the thunder vortex to move again. Mo Ya roughly understood the movement trajectory of the thunder vortex. Since she relied on Guyangfeng's supreme divine power to cross space, the range of space she could cross was very limited. The thunder vortex's devouring power was not omnidirectional, and it still had a certain blind spot. As long as one was in the blind spot of the thunder vortex, one would not be devoured. Just as Mo Ya was thinking about this, she saw Guyangfeng's hand seal change again. At the same time, another thunder vortex appeared on the opposite side of the existing thunder vortex. When the thunder vortex appeared on the opposite side, Mo Ya clearly felt that the devouring power had suddenly increased. Mo Ya was forced to move away. Chapter 57:18 Thunderbolt Whirlpool. Kang Xinmu released his black dragon scales. Coupled with the power of the supreme dark steel, he forcefully resisted the tearing force of the thunderbolt whirlpool and entered it. Because the power in the center of the thunderbolt whirlpool was too concentrated, it formed a narrow space that was not enclosed. However, this narrow space was not safe. Instead, he would be oppressed by the various forces of the thunderbolt whirlpool and even by external forces. With the power of the supreme dark steel, the tearing force of the thunderbolt whirlpool could not cause any harm to Kang Xinmu. He could even see the corpses of the cultivators that had been sucked in, accompanied by the pungent smell of blood. How strong was the power of the thunderbolt whirlpool? The corpses that had been thrown into this space were quickly crushed. In just a few short breaths, other cultivators were sucked in. Kang Xinmu watched as the cultivators that were sucked in instantly disappeared into the surrounding space. The area next to this space was close to the center of the thunderbolt whirlpool. According to common sense, this was also the place where the tearing force of the thunderbolt whirlpool was the strongest. The center of the thunderbolt whirlpool would superimpose the surrounding forces. As the speed of the thunderbolt whirlpool increased and as time passed, the pressure in the empty space at the center would only become stronger. The reason why Kang Shinmu took the risk to enter the Thunderbolt Whirlpool was to absorb its power. As one of the secret techniques of Everlasting Pavilion's Guyangfeng, the Thunderbolt Whirlpool had the ability to devour. Kang Shinmu also had the ability to devour. If he could obtain the power of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool, then his ability to devour could become a secret technique like the Thunderbolt Whirlpool. Just as he was thinking about how to absorb the power of the Thunderbolt Whirlpool, Kang Shinmu realized that the space around him had suddenly increased. Kang Shinmu was keenly aware of the reason for the sudden increase in space. There was one more Thunderbolt Whirlpool. In other words, Guyangfeng had created a mirror Thunderbolt Whirlpool. The two Thunderbolt Whirlpools were opposite each other, but the power they produced was surprisingly the same. With the appearance of the mirror Thunderbolt Whirlpool, more and more cultivators and other things were sucked in. This time, before these cultivators could even get close to the center, they were all smashed to smithereens. The cultivators who were sucked in were mostly at the 3rd or 4th level of Supreme Divine Power. So far, there were no cultivators at the 5th level. In other words, the suction force of Guyangfeng's Thunder Whirlpool could only devour cultivators who were below Divine Power level 5. If he wanted to absorb more powerful cultivators with Supreme Divine Power, he would need to use a corresponding spell technique to lock onto them. Just now, Guyangfeng had used a spell to lock on him and Emoya. Kang Shinmu had no idea what kind of spell Guyangfeng had cast. He only had one thought in his mind, and that was to devour the Thunder Vortex. Even if there were 2 lightning vortexes, Kang Shinmu still wanted to devour them. Kang Shinmu ignored the cultivators and other things that the lightning whirlpool sucked in from the outside world. As long as Emoya was safe, nothing else mattered. Kang Shinmu focused his mind and released his devouring power. The moment the devouring power was released, it began to devour. Kang Shinmu was now in the center of the Thunder Vortex. After the devouring power was released, it first devoured the power in the center of the Thunder Vortex. After devouring, the power of the Thunder Vortex began to disintegrate. After a few breaths, Guyangfeng noticed that there was something wrong with the power of the Thunder Vortex. Humph, it's just an ant struggling before death. Guyangfeng immediately guessed that it was Kang Shinmu's trick. Guyangfeng had expected that Kang Shinmu would not be devoured by the Thunder Vortex. After all, if he was swallowed by the Thunder Vortex, then Kang Shinmu would be too weak. Such a weakling was not worthy of being Feng Er's opponent. The fact that Kang Shinmu could persist in the Thunder Vortex for so long showed that he had some skills. However, it was a fool's dream to think that he could survive in his Thunder Vortex. Guyangfeng's hand gestures changed a few times, and the spinning speed of the Thunder Vortex suddenly increased. At the same time, several streams of black aura condensed around him and headed straight for the Thunder Vortex. This black aura was Guyangfeng's Supreme Divine Power. It was the Supreme Fog Power. However, due to the Thunderbolt Whirlpool of his secret technique, his innate talent had undergone a certain change during the cultivation process. Over time, the color of Guyangfeng's talent, Fog Power, turned black. Later on, when his cultivation base reached the Supreme Superior level, the Supreme Mist turned black. Several streams of Supreme Fog Power condensed into the shape of lightning and rushed toward the Thunder Vortex. Kang Shinmu, who was in the center of the Thunder Vortex, had already sensed Guyangfeng's arrival the moment he released the Supreme Fog Power. As far as Kang Shinmu was concerned, Guyangfeng's Supreme Fog Power was at the peak of the 8th level. As long as it was still at the 8th level, he was still far from the Gate of Law. Without the power of law, Guyangfeng was not that difficult to deal with. Kang Shinmu skillfully used the Supreme Soul Power and continued to release his devouring power to devour the Thunder Vortex. At the same time, Kang Shinmu released the Supreme Divine Flame Power to contend with Guyangfeng's Supreme Fog Power. The Supreme Fog Power and Kang Shinmu's Supreme Divine Flame Power were exactly the opposite. Although they were both in the 8th level, the moment Kang Shinmu released the Supreme Divine Flame Power, he also released the Supreme Divine Flame Domain. In a breath's time, the Supreme Divine Flame Domain had already spread out with Kang Shinmu as the center. Soon, the supreme divine flame domain covered the entire thunder vortex. The moment the supreme divine flame domain covered the entire thunder vortex, it seemed to have reached the boundary and could no longer spread out. Kang Shinmu gathered his soul consciousness and once again released the supreme divine flame domain. This time, the supreme divine flame domain exceeded the range of the thunder vortex. However, no matter what, it could not spread to the range of the thunder vortex. While Kang Shinmu was puzzled, Gu Yangfeng's expression changed greatly. He discovered that his thunder vortex was actually out of control. What was worse was that there was an extremely powerful devouring power that was currently devouring the thunder vortex. In a moment of desperation, Gu Yangfeng also released the supreme divine flame domain. Although his movements were fast, he was still a step too slow. After Kang Shinmu's supreme divine flame domain was released with the help of his soul consciousness, it meant that the devouring power had devoured the thunder vortex. When the devouring power had first devoured the thunder vortex had tried to devour the devouring power. Now that the devouring power had been tempered by the 7 devouring demons' sealing art, its strength was incomparable to before. When the thunder vortex began to devour, the devouring power had already shrunk along with the thunder vortex. By the time the thunder vortex retracted, the devouring power had already completely devoured the thunder vortex. After absorbing the power of the thunder vortex, Kang Shinmu clearly felt that the devouring power had undergone a qualitative change. Kang Shinmu circulated his own power and released his thunder vortex. Chapter 57:19. The moment Kang Shinmu released the thunder whirlpool, Gu Yangfeng sensed its existence. However, the conceited Gu Yangfeng did not believe that Kang Shinmu could release the thunder whirlpool. Moreover, the thunder whirlpool was the secret technique of the everlasting pavilion's elder. The successors before him had long since wandered the world, and it had already been several hundred years, perhaps even over 1,000 years since there had been any news of them. It could be said that he was the only one who possessed the thunder whirlpool secret technique. Gu Yangfeng controlled his supreme divine power and condensed another thunder whirlpool. This was Gu Yangfeng's limit. Gu Yangfeng could release 3 thunder whirlpools at the same time. In other words, on the basis of the 2 mirror thunder whirlpools, he added an outer thunder whirlpool. From the outside, the 3rd thunder whirlpool wrapped around the mirror thunder whirlpool. The moment he released the 3rd thunder whirlpool, Gu Yangfeng instantly noticed that something was wrong. In the mirror thunder whirlpool, the power in the center of the thunder whirlpool was disintegrating. Even with the addition of his supreme divine power, the power in the thunder whirlpool was still rapidly disintegrating. Not long after, the front thunder whirlpool completely disappeared. No, it didn't disappear. It was still there. Gu Yangfeng could still see the thunder whirlpool in front of him, but he could not feel the connection. Only then did he realize that the thunder whirlpool in front of him was the one released by Kang Shinmu. "Kid, why do you have the thunder whirlpool secret technique?" This was the point that Gu Yangfeng could not understand at this time. Kang Shinmu, this kid, was a nobody. This secret technique of yours needs to be strengthened. After Kang Shinmu devoured the thunder whirlpool, he discovered the hidden dangers of the thunder whirlpool during the process of releasing it. If he released the thunder whirlpool according to Gu Yangfeng's method, the biggest drawback would be the center of the thunder whirlpool. If he encountered a stronger cultivator, he could cast a spell in the center of the thunder whirlpool and disintegrate it. Or he could use his supreme divine power to control the thunder whirlpool to achieve the purpose of reverse rotation. In this way, the thunder whirlpool would concentrate all the power in the periphery and rush to the caster. Kang Shinmu had just thought of this and missed a good opportunity. Fortunately, there were 2 other lightning whirlpools. Kang Shinmu did whatever he thought of. After absorbing the lightning vortex, Kang Shinmu's figure appeared in Gu Yangfeng's field of vision. However, before Gu Yangfeng could further control Kang Shinmu leaped into the opposite side of the mirror image. As soon as he entered, he did as he had planned. It was not difficult to control the lightning whirlpool. Just by relying on the supreme power of the soul, he could achieve his goal of control. Although his supreme soul power hadn't improved much since he had obtained it, it wasn't weak either. It remained at the 5th floor. Supreme soul power was different from other supreme divine powers. It was a supreme divine power that was closely related to one's soul and consciousness. With the power of the 5th level of the Supreme Soul and Kang Shinmu's current soul consciousness, he easily controlled the lightning whirlpool on the other side of the mirror image. Then, he cast a spell and reversed the flow of the lightning vortex. As expected, all the power in the center of the lightning vortex surged toward the periphery. The speed of the lightning vortex's rotation was proportional to the strength of the caster's spell. Kang Shinmu cast the spell, causing the lightning vortex's speed to reach an unprecedented height. Guiyang Feng saw that the lightning vortex on the other side of the mirror image had lost control, but he had no choice but to use the third lightning vortex to resist the power of the lightning vortex that had gone out of control. It was only then that Guiyang Feng realized the extent of Jiang Shenwu's power. Looking at the spinning speed of the lightning vortex on the other side of the mirror image, Guiyang Feng was shocked. Even at his peak, he hadn't reached such a height. Kang Shinmu reached it easily. Now, even though Guiyang Feng had witnessed the strength of Kang Shinmu's control of the lightning vortex, he refused to believe that this was Kang Shinmu's true strength. In his eyes, Kang Shinmu was just a junior who had obtained some opportunities by chance. However, Guiyang Feng tried his best, but still failed to use the third lightning vortex to resist the attack of the lightning vortex on the other side of the mirror image. In a breath's time, the power of the lightning vortex controlled by Kang Shinmu had already attacked. Guiyang Feng was astonished by how strong he was. In the end, Guiyang Feng had to give up the third lightning vortex. Even so, he still couldn't resist the attack of the lightning vortex controlled by Kang Shinmu. I told you, your lightning vortex has serious drawbacks. Kang Shinmu glanced at Guiyang Feng, who had been repelled, and sneered. This is impossible. Guiyang Feng kept muttering, and finally, as if he had made up his mind, he suddenly stood up. He had been forced to this point by Kang Shinmu, so he had no choice but to fight with him. Now, Guiyang Feng could even think that the reason why he couldn't contact Feng Er was that she had been killed by Kang Shinmu. And Hai Fan, who had been missing for a long time. Guiyang Feng's eyes were red. The seals in his hands changed quickly, and finally detonated the third lightning vortex. At the same time, there was also his own supreme divine power. Is this your counterattack before you die? You are worse than them. After going through the lightning vortex, Kang Shinmu roughly figured out Guiyang Feng's real strength. Although his supreme divine power had reached the 8th level, or even the peak of the 8th level. But the power of the supreme fog was still inferior to the power of his supreme divine fire. What made Kang Shinmu afraid was probably the moment when the power of the supreme fog combined with the lightning vortex. This was Guiyang Feng's strength. Naturally, Kang Shinmu would not allow him to release this move perfectly. Therefore, a long time ago, he had released the power of the Supreme Soul to block it. Boy, who do you think we are? Don't be too arrogant, or you won't even know when you will die. As soon as Guiyang Feng's words fell, Kang Shinmu's attack had already arrived. At the same time, Kang Shinmu's figure had already approached. At this moment, Guiyang Feng seemed to see a seal flash in Kang Shinmu's eyes. That is a seal. It was the seal they were looking for. Seal, Guiyang Feng wanted to shout this news, but he did not have the chance. Kang Shinmu quickly ended Guiyang Feng's life, and then flicked his sleeves and left. Moya was a little surprised to see Kang Shinmu walking over unscathed. After not seeing each other for a while, Kang Shinmu's cultivation had improved a lot. In particular, after comprehending part of the power of the seal, his entire strength had reached a qualitative leap. Not bad. Moya smiled gently. It's all thanks to the good opportunity created by Senior. Kang Shinmu was grateful to Moya from the bottom of his heart. His current strength was indeed inseparable from Moya's company. After the two left, the battlefield became lively. No one would have thought that the insufferably arrogant elder Guyangfeng of the Everlasting Pavilion would be defeated by a nobody. According to their conversation just now, perhaps Gufeng, whom the Everlasting Pavilion's eldest senior brother was looking for, was most likely dead. Chapter 57:20. The news that Guyangfeng had been defeated by an unknown person spread like wildfire. Those who entered the secret realm were all famous sects in the outer realm. Even the itinerant cultivators were all big shots with some reputation. Hearing this news, everyone was ready to watch a good show. Everyone wanted to know what the Everlasting Pavilion was going to do about this matter. In fact, the Everlasting Pavilion appeared to be quite calm. Only the great senior brother of the Everlasting Pavilion, Dan Yuanfei, was frantically searching for Gu Feng's whereabouts. As for whether Guyangfeng would be defeated or not, no one cared. The news about the star map lock was not a secret in the outer realm. On the contrary, all the cultivators who entered the secret realm knew about it. They also knew that the 4 great sects in the outer realm had a map of the location of the star map lock. They even knew the specific location of the star map lock. What did the star map lock mean? It was equivalent to a Dharma seal. Later, a piece of news spread in the secret realm that the star map lock was a kind of spatial Dharma seal. Regardless of who spread the news, the star atlas lock had become a must-have for all the cultivators who entered this place. Because of this, more and more cultivators gathered in the secret realm. Tang Xiaoyu was the first cultivator to discover the location of the Dharma seal. He immediately told the news to Kang Xinmu. Kang Xinmu successfully obtained the Dharma seal and comprehended it. Comprehending the Dharma seal meant that the star map lock no longer existed. Instead, it was in the form of a Dharma seal and belonged to Kang Xinmu. Some cultivators went to the palace one after another. The palace that they saw this time was not as shabby as the one Kang Xinmu had seen. Instead, it was in a new state. The new palace door was also open. They could still see the Dharma seal in the palace. For this reason, they used all their skills to compete for the Dharma seal in the palace. After defeating Guyangfeng, Kang Xinmu and Moya returned to the cave residence. As soon as the two of them arrived at the surface of the cave residence, they were shocked by the scene in front of them. The first time they went to the cave abode, they were chased underground by Gufeng. Only then did they see the cave abode with the star map lock. The Immortals' Cave was located underground where they were currently standing. The cave abode was dozens of feet above the ground. At this moment, they saw the cave abode standing on the surface. The cave abode that he saw underground was the same as what he could see now. Even the array formation at the entrance of the cave abode was restored by some cultivators. Tsk tisk. Kang Xinmu sighed. The cultivators who came this time are really crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Moving the cave abode to the surface was a powerful move, but he did not expect that there would be an even more powerful move, which was to restore the formation at the entrance of the cave abode that he had destroyed. I can tell that he has not only unleashed his supreme divine power, but he has also unleashed some sort of secret technique. Moya's beautiful eyes swept the abode before her as she spoke in a soft voice. It feels like the power of the Supreme Holy Land? The reason why Kang Xinmu was uncertain was that there were indeed traces of the power of the Supreme Holy Land, but it did not seem to be limited to this type of supreme divine power. There is the power of the Supreme Holy Land, but there should be 2 other types of supreme divine power. Moya sized him up for a moment and said gently. 3 types of supreme divine power? Kang Xinmu was a little surprised. Moya nodded. Kang Xinmu released his soul consciousness again to sense. The space around the cave abode seemed to have traces of distortion. Power of space? Could it be the power of supreme space? Although the passageway into this mystic realm contained many elements of the power of nature, he had devoured all of them. Now, there should be the power of nature in the passageway that contained the power of supreme space. Very similar. Even Moya could sense the existence of the power of supreme space. Since the other party had unleashed the power of supreme space, he must have wielded the power of supreme space before it became a single supreme divine power. If that was the case, it was not surprising that this person possessed 3 types of supreme divine power. A cultivator of such strength could move the cave abode out and even restore the formation at the entrance of the cave abode. It was most likely something that could be done easily. Then, here came the question. Was the star map lock still in the cave abode? Other than the power of the Supreme Holy Land and the power of supreme space, there was another type of supreme divine power that Kang Shinmu could not guess at the moment. If he did not sense it, why did he determine that there were 3 types of supreme divine power? Of course, it was because of the seal. The seal tempered one's soul consciousness, and one's soul consciousness could sense traces of supreme divine power. He could sense the power of the Supreme Holy Land and the power of supreme space because he possessed these 2 types of supreme divine power. As for the 3rd type, he could only sense traces of it being unleashed, but he could not determine it. Senior, what is the 3rd type of supreme divine power? Since he could not think of it, he asked Imoya. The traces of the 3rd type of supreme divine power are a little vague, so I am not very sure. However, we can determine it from the cave abode itself, Imoya said gently. Hearing that, Kang Shinmu sized up the cave abode again. The cave abode was exactly the same as the one he had seen for the first time. The formation had also been restored perfectly. On the surface, there did not seem to be any major problems. Wait a minute. Restored. A light bulb went off in Kang Shinmu's head. The formation at the entrance of the cave abode had been restored. Also, the appearance of this cave abode was exactly the same as the appearance when they had first entered the cave abode. It had been so long. Many cultivators should have found the cave abode and discovered the existence of the star map lock. Because of that, a battle was unavoidable. The cultivators who came here were all powerhouses with supreme divine power of level 5 or even level 6 and above. If they were to fight, the cave abode would definitely be destroyed. Now that the cave abode had appeared on the surface, it meant that the cave abode had been restored. Power of restoration? Kang Shinmu stated the conclusion that he had made based on his observations. It should be the power of restoration. Moya analyzed and came to a conclusion. Supreme power of restoration? Kang Shinmu pondered about this supreme divine power. This is not a single supreme divine power. It is a type of multi-element supreme divine power, Moya added. Senior. Kang Shinmu suddenly realized something serious. Hearing that, Moya's beautiful eyes fell on Kang Shinmu. Do you still remember the 9 types of supreme divine power that I devoured from the Crimson Haze? Kang Shinmu said. Huh. Moya knew what Kang Shinmu was going to say when she heard that word. Among the 9 types of supreme divine power, there is a supreme power of restoration? It seems a little different. Kang Shinmu sensed again and realized that among the 9 types of supreme divine power that he possessed, there was no supreme power of restoration. It is the power of restoration. Kang Shinmu confirmed again and said. Supreme power of restoration? Moya's beautiful eyes lit up. Yes. Kang Shinmu found it strange too. Chapter 57:21. Supreme Regenerative Force restores the surface of the damaged object, while Supreme Regenerative Force restores the inner part of the damaged object. Moya pondered for a moment according to her observation and said. The cave abode that appeared in front of them looked the same as before. It had obviously been restored. The formation guarding the entrance of the cave abode was indeed destroyed by Gufeng back then. Now that it appeared at the entrance of the cave abode intact, it had also been restored. At this time, there were also cultivators coming in one after another. Although the cultivators who came later were obstructed by the formation, the strength of the formation was obviously not as strong as when Kang Shinmu first opened it. In other words, the formation had only been restored. In other words, the other party was using Supreme Regenerative Force. Obviously, Supreme Regenerative Force could only restore the surface of the object, but not the inner part of the object. It was the same for the cave abode. The parts of the cave abode that were revealed to the cultivators had already been restored. But inside the cave abode, there were still some traces left by the cultivators who had gone through a battle. It had not been completely restored. I see. After listening to Mo Ya's explanation, Kang Shinmu had a rough understanding of the difference between Supreme Regenerative Force and Supreme Regenerative Force. In other words, he had Supreme Regenerative Force and could restore the inner part of the damaged object. If he comprehended Supreme Regenerative Force, didn't it mean that there was no such thing as injury? He could completely use Supreme Regenerative Force to heal his injuries. This was simply a kind of heaven-defying Supreme Regenerative Force. Kang Shinmu, although Supreme Regenerative Force can restore the inner part of the object, it can't heal by itself. Mo Ye knew what Kang Shinmu was thinking and could not help but chuckle. Can't heal by itself? Kang Shinmu could not hide the disappointment on his face. He suddenly felt that this Supreme Regenerative Force was not very useful. It's not that it can't heal by itself. If you reach a certain level, you can heal by yourself. Mo Ye said softly. If the Supreme Regenerative Force reaches level 9, and you have an epiphany of the rules, you can use the mysterious power of the rules to achieve the goal of self-healing. Of course, there are other conditions. Level 9? Conditions? Kang Shinmu could not help but laugh when he heard this. He hadn't grasped the Supreme Recovery ability yet, so it was still too early to think about this. Once you grasp the Supreme Recovery ability, you will naturally slowly understand it, Mo Ye said. Kang Shinmu did not continue to dwell on the Supreme Regenerative ability. First, he had to solve the current situation. Since the cave had already been moved out, the Star Atlas lock would also be moved out along with the cave. Wait a minute. No. Suddenly, Kang Shinmu thought of an extremely serious matter. The reason why they couldn't obtain the Star Atlas lock was because the Star Atlas lock was surrounded by the power of magic. Without dispelling the Dermic might, he would not be able to take away the Star Atlas lock. If the power of magic still existed on the Star Atlas lock, even if the cave abode was moved out, the Star Atlas lock should still be in its original position underground. Senior. Kang Shinmu called out to Mo Ye, and Mo Ye understood. The two of them took a detour around the cave and returned to the underground via the original route. After the cave was moved away, a bottomless pit appeared on the ground. Logically speaking, the Star Atlas lock should exist somewhere in the pit, and it was very likely to be floating in the center of the pit. However, the two of them did not find the Star Atlas lock. Kang Shinmu released his soul consciousness and extended it throughout the pit, but he could not find the Star Atlas lock. Could it be that the Star Atlas lock is also in the cave abode? Kang Shinmu did not dare to believe it. To move the Star Atlas lock, one had to first crack the power of magic. Could it be that that person had cracked the power of magic? Let's go up and take a look, Mo Ye said. The two of them came to the surface again. More and more cultivators entered the cave abode, but from the beginning, there were only cultivators entering, and no cultivators coming out. Seeing this, Kang Shinmu could not help but be vigilant. Kang Shinmu, I keep feeling that there's something fishy going on. Mo Ye observed the cave abode, and even used her divine power to check it. The cave abode was still the original cave abode, but it gave off a very unfamiliar feeling. Senior, why don't you wait here? I'll go in and take a look first, Kang Shinmu said after thinking for a while. No, let's go together. Kang Shinmu was worried about Mo Ye, and Mo Ye was also worried about Kang Shinmu. The cultivator who moved the cave abode was an expert with 3 types of supreme divine power. It was really dangerous for Kang Shinmu to go in alone. But, before Kang Shinmu could finish his words, he saw a spear piercing over from the side. He hurriedly pulled Mo Ye and dashed to the side. The spear missed and stopped in midair. Immediately, a young man in a red and green silk robe dashed over from the side, holding a spear that flashed with green light. This person was dressed in fancy clothes, and the spear was not only green, but also flashed with other colors. However, the spear's handle was engraved with the mark of Everlasting Pavilion. He was sure that this person was from Everlasting Pavilion. You too, He Zhanghai glanced at Kang Shinmu, then his eyes fell on Emoya. The ferocious look on his face disappeared in an instant and was replaced by a flattering smile. I'm He Zhanghai, may I ask for your name? He Zhanghai stared straight at Emoya and grinned. Emoya was disgusted and ignored him. He Zhanghai didn't feel awkward at all. Instead, he laughed and said, I like a reserved girl like you. Emoya still did not say anything. From the moment He Zhanghai's eyes fell on Emoya, Kang Shinmu's face did not look good. He stood in front of Emoya, protecting her behind him. It's a pity that such a beautiful flower is stuck in cow dung. He Zhanghai's attention finally fell on Kang Shinmu, and his words and actions showed his disdain for Kang Shinmu. Seeing Emoya closely following behind Kang Shinmu, he inexplicably developed a deep hostility for Kang Shinmu. If he killed this guy, he could get the beauty. He Zhanghai, who only wanted Emoya, completely forgot the purpose of this trip. Cow dung, do you dare to fight with me? He Zhanghai pointed the spear in his hand at Kang Shinmu and shouted. Kang Shinmu naturally would not pay attention to He Zhanghai. If he agreed, wouldn't it mean that he admitted that he was cow dung? The two glanced at He Zhanghai, then turned around and left. Stop. He Zhanghai obviously did not want to let the two go, especially since he did not want Emoya to leave with Kang Shinmu. If you don't have the guts to fight with me, then let go. Don't delay the girl. He Zhanghai's words made the passers-by laugh. Chapter 57:22. You don't even know the details. Don't pretend to be knowledgeable. He Zhanghai scolded coldly when he heard that. Ha! The crowd burst into laughter because of his words. There were 4 major sects in the outer region, and the Everlasting Pavilion was one of them. However, the people in the outer region basically only acknowledged the status of the Everlasting Pavilion on the surface. After all, the ancestors of the Everlasting Pavilion had established themselves earlier. The reason why the Everlasting Pavilion could become one of the 4 major sects was not because of their strength, but because they were the first to arrive. Of course, the fact that the Everlasting Pavilion could establish itself among the 4 major sects for thousands of years meant that the sect's foundation was strong enough. Among the 4 major sects, when some keywords were mentioned, they would think of the corresponding sect. For example, when the myriad origin superimposition technique was mentioned, it would be related to the Heaven Yuan Palace. But the Everlasting Pavilion was different. Each elder had a corresponding elder's secret technique, and each elder's secret technique was different, and it would not be passed on to the next generation. This kind of behavior was really confusing. When the Everlasting Pavilion was mentioned, most people in the outer region would unanimously think of a sentence: when a sect is big, there are all kinds of people. They were already used to He Zhanghai's behavior. Putting aside He Zhanghai's character, He Zhanghai looked decent, and his strength was also very strong. He was an outstanding young disciple. Unfortunately, this person was a infatuated person. He loved everyone he saw, and if he couldn't get them, he would destroy them. The girls that he had his eyes on never had a good ending. Everyone glanced at the girl that He Zhanghai had his eyes on, which was Emoya, and couldn't help but feel sympathy. This girl had an extraordinary temperament and a graceful figure, just like a pretty beauty that had entered the mortal world. She followed Kang Shinmu, and other than being a little weak, everything else was not bad. This person, from the first time Kang Shinmu saw He Zhanghai, he felt that this person was not a decent person. Sure enough, as soon as he opened his mouth, he revealed his true nature. Kang Shinmu didn't want this kind of person to disturb Emoya, so he wanted to leave with Emoya. However, He Zhanghai didn't have any eyesight. He couldn't see Emoya's disdain for him, and Kang Shinmu's hostility towards him, so he repeatedly stopped him. Kang Shinmu. Emoya called out to Kang Shinmu softly. Wait for me here, I'll go meet him, and then we'll go to the cave together. Kang Shinmu couldn't take it anymore. This was the first time he had seen such a high-quality item. Miss, are you going there? I'll go with you. He Zhanghai looked at the cave and waved his hand. The door of the cave opened completely. The door was destroyed, but it did not reveal the interior of the cave. Moreover, no cultivators could be seen at the entrance of the cave. The cultivators who entered the cave abode seemed to have disappeared from the cave abode. There's a formation protecting this place, as well as the might of the Star Atlas Lock. It's extremely dangerous, He Zhanghai said lightly. Halfway through his words, he suddenly cast a spell at Kang Shinmu, knocking Kang Shinmu into the cave's entrance. Kang Shinmu's mind was focused on the white figure that flashed at the entrance of the cave abode. He was not careful and fell into the trap. Moya had been on guard against He Zhanghai. Seeing this scene, she protected Kang Shinmu first and entered the cave abode with Kang Shinmu. Cave abode. After Kang Shinmu and Moya entered, they found that the scene inside was the same as what they saw at the time. The only difference was the entrance of the cave abode. Standing in the cave abode, they couldn't see outside the cave abode. The scene that they saw was the scene inside the cave abode. Even the position of the entrance was the furnishings in the cave abode. The two of them tried and they could still pass through this place. Even so, they were still in the cave abode and did not leave the cave abode. Kang Shinmu, this cave abode has really been modified by someone. Moya sized up the situation in the cave abode and said in a deep voice. Yes, let's not separate from each other. Kang Shinmu nodded. As soon as he said that, Kang Shinmu's eyes fell on the place where they came in. A fierce look flashed in his eyes. Moya looked at Kang Shinmu with a puzzled expression. That brat is so arrogant. We have to teach him a lesson. Kang Shinmu said calmly. After saying that, he formed a seal with both of his hands and pressed the space in front of him. Then, a door appeared in the space. The moment the door appeared, everything outside was revealed, including He Zhanghai who was about to enter. How did you do it? Moya was a little surprised. Soon, she thought of how Kang Shinmu did it. Dermic seal, Kang Shinmu said. Kang Shinmu used the power of the dermic seal and soon found the strange thing at the entrance of the cave abode. The cave abode had been moved to the ground by that mysterious cultivator. At most, he had restored everything in the cave abode to its original state. However, because of the Star Atlas Lock in the cave abode, he seemed to have moved the Star Atlas Lock up, so he would definitely activate the power of the Star Atlas Lock and produce all kinds of Dharma formations. Now, the door of the cave abode was a Dharma formation formed by the power of the Dharma formation. The thing that Kang Shinmu was afraid of was the cultivator who had done all this. He was the one who had 3 types of supreme divine powers. The white figure that flashed by just now was most likely that cultivator. After Kang Shinmu came in, he first released the supreme soul power. After ensuring that there were no problems in the surroundings, he began to release the power of the dermic seal. Kang Shinmu activated the Dharma formation at the door of the cave abode and combined the power of the dermic seal to separate the space in the Dharma formation and the space at the entrance of the cave abode. After doing all that, He Zhanghai came in. The moment he entered, Kang Shinmu activated the power of the dermic seal and sent He Zhanghai into the separated space. As for where the separated space would lead to, Kang Shinmu didn't know and didn't want to care. Then, the two of them came to the place where the Star Atlas Lock was placed. The closer they got, the stronger the pressure they felt. In the end, the two of them released their supreme divine powers to resist the pressure and walked into the cave abode. The Star Atlas Lock was still there. Not only did it exist, but the pressure that permeated the surroundings was getting stronger. Obviously, the power of the Star Atlas Lock was still there. Perhaps it was because of the power of the Star Atlas Lock, but there weren't many cultivators in the cave abode. Kang Shinmu didn't hesitate. He gathered the power of the dermic seal and got closer to the Star Atlas Lock. The closer he got to the Star Atlas Lock, the clearer he could feel the power of the dermic seal. The repulsive power of the dermic seal was so strong that it made it difficult for Kang Shinmu to even stand. He simply gathered the dermic seal again and released it. The dermic seal floated above the star atlas lock, stopped, and slowly rotated. At the same time, lines of words appeared on the star atlas lock. The densely packed words danced, and in an instant, they covered the entire cave abode. In the end, the words formed lines of lines, which looked like the dermic seal at first glance. The moment the pattern was formed, it fell on the dermic seal. When the two came into contact, Kang Shinmu felt the power of the dermic seal surrounding the star atlas lock. Its essence was indeed the power of rule. The power of the dermic seal finally fell into the dermic seal, which could be considered as breaking the power of the star atlas lock. Chapter 57-23. Star Map Lock. It disappeared right in front of Kang Shinmu and Emoya's eyes. "Senior, over there." Kang Shinmu soon noticed a subtle change in the space next to him. He immediately brought Emoya to where the space was abnormal. Emoya's eyes curved, and a dangerous look flashed across her eyes. This person was interesting. He caught up with them so quickly and hid himself so well. 15 minutes later, Kang Shinmu and Emoya arrived at a secret room. The two of them had been to this secret room before, and it did not seem to have changed much on the surface. When the two of them arrived, they roughly checked out the cave abode's current situation. The structure of the cave abode was basically the same as before, but it gave off the illusion that one could not leave the cave abode. Without a doubt, the mysterious cultivator had cast a corresponding spell on the cave abode when he moved it out. Kang Shinmu could clearly sense traces of the Supreme Holy Land's power in the surroundings. As for the Supreme Space Power, he had only devoured the Supreme Space Power's power of nature. He had yet to comprehend it, so he could not unleash this power. However, he was certain that the entire cave abode was affected by the Supreme Space Power. Of course, the Supreme Restoration Power could not be ignored. That mysterious cultivator did not hesitate to expend such a supreme divine power to move the cave abode out. What exactly was his goal? To possess the Supreme Space Power, one must have an extraordinary background. For such a powerhouse to break the power on the star map lock, it would be a piece of cake. However, the reality was that the mysterious cultivator did not break the power on the star map lock. He did not even plan to take the star map lock away. This was something that Kang Shinmu could not understand. "Kang Shinmu, you know about the other realm, right?" Emoya looked around and realized that all the secret rooms and lounges around the cave abode had space barriers. Such a technique of space barriers reminded Emoya of the other realm. The dead spirit clan of the 4 ancestor corpse clans of the other realm appeared with the flame of dead spirits. It was said that when the flame of dead spirits reached a certain level, it could create space barriers. This kind of spatial barrier was different from ordinary spatial barriers. The flame of the undead spirits was a kind of flame power. Because it had existed among the dead spirit race for a long time, it had absorbed the local spirit veins of the dead spirit race and gradually evolved into a kind of existence similar to a supreme divine power. In other words, the flame of necromancy could evolve. Just like the supreme divine power, it could be continuously strengthened through continuous cultivation or actual combat. The flame of the undead spirits could also advance, but it was more difficult to do so. Not only did the flame of undead spirits have to devour the corresponding power, but the owner of the flame of undead spirits also had to have a certain level of divine power. If the two reached the same level, the flame of undead spirits could evolve. This level was infinitely close to the realm of laws. After the flame of the undead evolved, it would become a type of nomological power. In reality, this kind of power was above the supreme divine power, but it was inferior to the rule power. At that time, the flames of undead spirits would be able to create an undead barrier. The flame of undead spirits was the power of the undead spirit tribe from the other world. Under normal circumstances, the cultivators of this world could sign a contract with the living beings of the other world and bring them to this world if they had a summoning artifact of a higher level. When the dead spirit race of the 4 great corpse ancestor clans passed through the contract gate, if the flame of the undead spirits had the undead spirit barrier, it would gradually transform into a space barrier. This transformation process could be understood as an evolution after passing through the contract gate. Yes, I know. When Emoya mentioned the other world, the first thing that came to Kang Shinmu's mind was flame of the undead spirits. For some reason, the flame of the undead spirits had become active after entering the cave abode. The space barrier around this cave abode is the undead spirit barrier of the other world's flame of the undead spirits, Emoya said in a serious tone. Flame of the undead spirits? Kang Shinmu was a little confused. You can understand it this way. The flame of the undead spirits is comparable to a supreme divine power. It's the same as the replication power of the Nangong family's bloodline inheritance that you came into contact with. Emoya thought for a moment and said softly. Compared to supreme divine power, the flame of the undead spirits will be similar to other supreme divine powers. When the cultivator's strength reaches a certain level, they will achieve the goal of advancing. When the flame of the undead spirits reaches the 9th level, it will infinitely approach the power of the rule. At that time, the power of the barrier will be generated, which is equivalent to the rule. The power that is formed is the undead spirit barrier. Kang Shinmu basically understood Emoya's explanation. Senior, because the flame of the undead spirits can only come to this world through the contract gate, the undead spirit barrier that is formed will transform into a space barrier. Is that what you mean? Kang Shinmu immediately deduced the reason for the appearance of the space barrier in the cave abode. At the same time, he also understood why the flame of the undead spirits would become active. That's right. Emoya nodded. Senior, could it be that there is a space barrier in the cave abode, which causes the internal space pattern of the cave abode to change, creating an illusion that one can only enter but not exit? Kang Shinmu asked. You're right. However, it's not an illusion that one can only enter but not exit. It's the truth. Emoya's beautiful eyes glanced straight ahead. There was an entrance to the space barrier right in front of them. Once one entered the entrance of the space barrier, one would be trapped in it and would be unable to get out of it. In other words, after entering the space barrier, one would fall into its own space and be lost within, unable to leave the cave abode. Even if a cultivator broke through the space barrier, they might not be able to return to the cave abode. That was the main reason why there were more and more cultivators entering the cave abode, but not many left. Senior, when Kang Shinmu realized the space barrier, he was suddenly worried about his and Emoya's current situation. However, he soon realized that they did not enter the space barrier. According to the flame of the undead spirit's indication, there was an entrance that seemed to be a space barrier right in front of them. We didn't enter the space barrier, but we can't be careless because I realized that the space barrier will move at irregular intervals. Emoya analyzed and said in a deep voice. The space barrier would move at irregular intervals, and if one was not careful, one would be sucked into it. I'm starting to not understand the purpose of that cultivator's actions. Kang Shinmu thought about it, but he still could not understand why the mysterious cultivator would do that. He had spent so much effort to move the cave abode to the surface, but his goal was not the star map lock. Since his goal was not the star map lock, what was the purpose of releasing the space barrier now? Could the other party be a member of the undead spirit clan from the other world? Since he was a member of the undead spirit clan, he must have contracted a Dharma artifact or someone related to it if he wanted to come to this world. Suddenly, Kang Shinmu clearly felt the flame of the undead spirits in his body move. The movement pointed to the back. Senior. Chapter 57-24. Just as the two of them moved away, the space where they were standing just now changed. Emoya was powerful enough to sense that there was an extra layer of space. Kang Shinmu also sensed that there was an extra layer of space with the help of the Dharma seal. This feeling of the space layer reminded Kang Shinmu of the manifestation origin superposition technique. The extra space layer just now was one of the entrances of the space rampart that suddenly moved here. At the same time, the entrance of the space rampart in front of them also began to move slowly. The moment it moved, there was a slightly familiar aura coming from behind the rampart. It was He Zhanghai's aura. Jiang Shenwu raised his eyebrows. His figure moved and he swept over. He grabbed the space layer next to the space rampart, and with a sudden force, he pulled out a figure. It was He Zhanghai. Moya was not surprised to see He Zhanghai. Although Kang Shinmu had sent him to the space that was separated from the entrance of the cave abode, it was not the space rampart after all. For a disciple from a big sect like He Zhanghai, who had mastered all kinds of powerful techniques, it was only a matter of time before he left the separated space. It was just that she did not expect him to come out so quickly. Not only that, but he also concealed his aura and took advantage of the time when they were breaking the power of the Star Atlas lock to snatch the Star Atlas lock. Yo, you're not bad, kid. After being caught red-handed by Kang Shinmu, He Zhanghai said with a fake smile. As soon as he saw Moya, he restrained his expression and tried to maintain his elegant demeanor. Miss, if you need the Star Atlas lock, I will give it to you. He Zhanghai's tone when talking to Moya was completely different from how he talked to Kang Shinmu. Even his voice had changed. If one only listened to the voice, it would be impossible to imagine that it was the same person who spoke. You stay away from her. Kang Shinmu stood in front of He Zhanghai. The reason why he did not attack He Zhanghai immediately was that when Kang Shinmu pulled him out just now, he had sensed that this was just one of He Zhanghai's clones. This clone did not have the aura of the Star Atlas lock. If he wanted to find the main body, he would have to rely on this clone. This action of Kang Shinmu's cast He Zhanghai to take a yard after taking an inch. This one is currently discussing official matters with Miss. Please do not interrupt. He Zhanghai said indifferently as he shot a disdainful glance at Kang Shinmu. You, Kang Shinmu raised his brows and curled his palm into a fist. Die. Without any hesitation, he punched He Zhanghai in the chest. He Zhanghai's body flew out and hit the wall in front of him. You brat, He Zhanghai didn't expect that Kang Shinmu would dare to attack him, and he was immediately enraged. Although this was only a clone, he was confident that he could defeat Kang Shinmu with just a clone. What he didn't expect was that after he was punched by Kang Shinmu didn't give him any chance to breathe and continued to attack. In a few breaths' time, He Zhanghai suffered dozens of punches from Kang Shinmu. Every punch contained Kang Shinmu's explosive Supreme Dragon martial technique. Every punch hit the flesh, and every punch was fatal. Kang Shinmu only used a little bit of his supreme divine power to completely suppress the meridians of He Zhanghai's clone, making him unable to use his supreme divine power. He Zhanghai's face instantly darkened. However, he didn't even have a chance to speak before his life was cut off by Kang Shinmu. As long as it was his clone, whether it was alive or not, it wouldn't hinder him from finding the main body. Unfortunately, Kang Shinmu couldn't sense the aura of He Zhanghai's main body from this clone. Instead, he wasted some time here. Kang Shinmu can't find the main body's aura. Moya hated He Zhanghai, but she knew the importance of the Star Atlas lock to Kang Shinmu, so she checked the situation of this clone. Who knew that she couldn't use this clone to sense the main body's location? He Zhanghai must have abandoned this clone from the beginning. Not only that, but he also used a special method to block the aura emitted by the Star Atlas lock. This way, even if the Star Atlas lock's magic power was broken, others still wouldn't be able to sense the existence of the Star Atlas lock. It's okay. The seal can sense the Star Atlas lock's location. Kang Shinmu had already understood the power of the seal. This also meant that the Star Atlas lock seal belonged to Kang Shinmu. No matter where the Star Atlas lock was, Kang Shinmu could sense its location using the seal. Although they were delayed here for some time, Kang Shinmu and Moya quickly caught up to He Zhanghai's main body. When he saw He Zhanghai, Kang Shinmu was shocked by He Zhanghai's strength again. The two of them watched him walk out of a space barrier as if nothing had happened. He Zhanghai was different from other cultivators. He wouldn't deliberately avoid space barriers. Instead, he could pass through them. His entire body was filled with a chilling aura. This aura was somewhat similar to Guyangfeng's lightning whirlpool. "Miss, I've more or less figured out the situation here. Do you need me to bring you out?" He Zhanghai was always humble and polite in front of Moya. Moya glanced at He Zhanghai indifferently and didn't say anything. "No need." Kang Shinmu coldly rejected He Zhanghai. "Who are you to the miss?" When He Zhanghai faced Kang Shinmu, not only did his face turn gloomy, but the aura around him also suddenly turned cold. "What do you think?" Kang Shinmu raised his eyebrows and said indifferently. "I don't care what your relationship with the miss was before. From now on, you and her will be separated from each other." When He Zhanghai finished speaking, he pressed his hand between his eyebrows. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The entire space began to tremble. An extremely oppressive aura was emitted from He Zhanghai's body. Kang Shinmu blocked this impact for Moya. At the same time, he also sensed what this force was. This aura contained the power of replication. In other words, this was the Nangong family's bloodline inheritance. Looking at He Zhanghai again, he had already completed his previous action. The moment he moved his hand away, the space between his eyebrows was revealed. There was a blood-red mark between his eyebrows. The shape of the mark was oval. After having such a mark between his eyebrows, He Zhanghai's entire aura changed. Then, with a wave of his hand, a white jade folding fan appeared in his hand. He Zhanghai opened the white jade folding fan and saw that there was an item on it. It was the Star Atlas lock. "I've underestimated you." He Zhanghai glanced at the Star Atlas lock on the white jade folding fan, then raised his eyes to look at Kang Shinmu. His eyes and brows were filled with hostility. "The magical seal has actually fallen into your hands." His tone suddenly became cold. The Star Atlas lock was a thorny item. That was why he had concealed its aura and wanted to take it away first. However, he had never thought that Kang Shinmu would still come looking for him. Not only that, but he had also interrupted his secret technique. Chapter 57-25. As Kang Shinmu operated the power of the seal, he could vaguely sense that there was a bit of dermic mite within it. After breaking the dermic mite on the Star Atlas lock, the dermic mite disappeared, and then the Star Atlas lock was taken away by He Zhanghai. It was only now that Kang Shinmu noticed the dermic mite. After the seal broke the dermic mite, it integrated into the seal. In other words, the dermic mite that accompanied the Star Atlas lock now belonged to him. As Kang Shinmu gathered the dermic mite, he could feel an abnormally powerful force enter his soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness. This kind of power was somewhat similar to the Supreme Soul Power. The difference was that the Supreme Soul Power was a kind of spiritual type Supreme God Power. The dermic mite, on the other hand, was comparable to the power of rules. To be exact, it was a kind of rules. Dermic mite, as its name suggested, was the majestic power of law. Originally, law represented a broader meaning, but this was the Star Atlas lock's dermic mite. Law also meant space. Mastering the Star Atlas lock's dermic mite could achieve the goal of verbal law enforcement. In other words, as long as it was within the scope of one's ability, one could use the teleportation formation to reach the destination even if one didn't know where the place was. Now, Kang Shinmu had this power. Of course, to reach the realm of verbal law enforcement, one still needed to step into the door of rules. This aroused Kang Shinmu's fighting spirit towards rules. If a transcendent God realm cultivator wanted to reach the Supreme God realm, they needed to devour the existing Supreme God realm and comprehend the Supreme God realm to reach the Supreme God realm. After comprehending the Supreme God realm, one had to keep comprehending it and continue to advance to the Supreme God realm. To advance to the Supreme God realm, other than constantly strengthening one's soul and consciousness, one had to keep fighting. The so-called fighting, to put it simply, was to absorb the corresponding Supreme God realm and achieve the goal of advancing to the Supreme God realm. What couldn't be ignored was that in the boundless universe, every type of Supreme God realm could devour the corresponding power of nature. For example, the supreme god realm's power of nature was all the power of fire that existed in the world. The power of the supreme divine flame could devour the power of the flames in the natural world. After continuous refinement, it could increase the power of the supreme divine flame. Kang Shinmu's unparalleled godly fire had already reached the 8th level. Previously, in the ancient desolate city, he had devoured several kinds of flame energy. At that time, the situation was more critical, so Kang Shinmu did not completely absorb them. At this moment, after the power of the Star Atlas Lock was absorbed by the Dermic Seal, it became Kang Shinmu's own power. This power of magic drew in his soul, consciousness, and sea of consciousness, causing the supreme divine fire domain to suddenly spread out. Even the supreme divine fire power began to circulate on its own. As the supreme divine fire continued to circulate, all the fire energy it had absorbed earlier was refined and became a part of the supreme divine fire. The unparalleled power of the divine flame, which had refined all the power of the flames, became even stronger. It was still actively operating, absorbing the surrounding flame power. The flame of the dead spirits within the extreme 10-directional devil seal was directly engulfed by the power of the supreme divine fire. At this moment, the flame of the dead spirits had completely become the supreme divine fire power. After devouring the flame of the dead spirits, the supreme divine fire power had become stronger in nature, and its appearance had also changed. The flame of the dead spirits was now dark green, and the supreme divine fire power had also turned dark green. In other words, it would be more appropriate to call the supreme divine fire power the supreme divine spirit flame now. After the supreme divine fire power had turned into the supreme divine spirit flame, it was slightly restrained. However, due to the influence of the surrounding space barrier, the supreme divine spirit flame did not stop and was still constantly circulating. It gave Kang Shinmu the feeling that the supreme divine spirit flame had formed layers of barriers. Kang Shinmu had mastered the power of magic, so he had a better understanding of the surrounding space, especially the surrounding space barrier. He could even clearly see every entrance of the surrounding space barrier, as well as the direction of the movement of the space barrier. With the supreme divine spirit flame, Kang Shinmu could determine that the person who had used the surrounding space barrier was not someone from the other world. It was more like someone had mastered the flame of the dead spirits and refined it to form a new type of power, which was how the space barrier was created. The refining method was the same as how he had refined the flame of the dead spirits. What Kang Shinmu was not sure about was whether the other party had the supreme divine fire power. If the supreme divine fire power had absorbed the flame of the dead spirits and created the space barrier, it would mean that the person had mastered 4 types of supreme divine powers at the same time. This person's strength had far exceeded what Kang Shinmu had imagined. The white figure that flashed by at the entrance of the cave abode might have been the mysterious cultivator. The changes that had happened to the supreme divine fire power in Kang Shinmu's body were naturally within He Zhanghai's sensing range. Although He Zhanghai was not sure what kind of fire power Kang Shinmu had absorbed, there was one thing that was clear, and that was that Kang Shinmu's supreme divine fire power had changed. However, no matter how the supreme divine fire power changed, it was just a diversified type of supreme divine powers, which was nothing to be afraid of. Since you have a death wish, I'll grant you your wish. He Zhanghai's cold eyes were filled with murderous intent. He waved his white jade folding fan and his figure suddenly disappeared on the spot. When he reappeared, he was already next to Kang Shinmu. His speed was fast, but it was within Kang Shinmu's grasp. Although Kang Shinmu's reaction was fast, he was still a step slower than He Zhanghai. Moya had been paying attention to He Zhanghai's every move since the beginning. Before He Zhanghai waved his white jade folding fan, Moya circulated her supreme divine powers and brought Kang Shinmu to the side immediately. When He Zhanghai's figure appeared, Moya had already brought Kang Shinmu away from his attack. Moya's action caused He Zhanghai's attack to miss, and it also made He Zhanghai develop a sense of reverence for Moya. You're indeed the lady that I admire. He Zhanghai's eyes were cold, but there was an unconcealable smile on his face. When Moya heard that, she retracted her gaze. She paid attention to He Zhanghai just now because she was afraid of his power, and not because of any other feelings. The aura of power that leaked out from He Zhanghai's body was very strange. Especially just now, when his figure moved, whether it was the surrounding air or the surrounding space, there was no trace at all. Just like when Kang Shinmu had just cracked the power of magic on the Star Atlas lock, He Zhanghai had also suddenly appeared and snatched away the Star Atlas lock. He learned from others that every elder of the Everlasting Pavilion had a specific secret technique. Could it be that this He Zhanghai was also an elder of the Everlasting Pavilion and had some kind of mysterious secret technique? Kang Shinmu had lingering fears. The power that He Zhanghai displayed just now could also be classified as space-related. That was not supreme divine powers, but it was even better than supreme divine powers. Chapter 57-26. Miss, could you please step aside and let me deal with this troublemaker first? He Zhanghai's eyes were merciful to Moya, but when he looked at Kang Shinmu, his eyes were filled with cold killing intent. Moya naturally would not step aside. She even had the urge to take the initiative to get rid of He Zhanghai. Kang Shinmu protected Moya tightly behind him. Even if he was not He Zhanghai's opponent, he had to protect Moya. Moreover, this was only the strength that he had shown on the surface. No matter how strong an opponent was, there would be a certain flaw. Moreover, he had to get the star map lock back. He Zhanghai saw Kang Shinmu's action and thought that it was because Kang Shinmu was forcibly preventing Moya from leaving, so he controlled his attack. It was not enough to hurt Moya, but it was enough to deal a heavy blow to Kang Shinmu. However, he ignored Kang Shinmu's ability. Kang Shinmu seemed to be able to see his attack clearly and always avoided it one step ahead. You took away Gufeng's power? By now, He Zhanghai had already seen through it. Kang Shinmu could clearly see through his positional spell, so he must have taken away Gufeng's power. He Zhanghai had two spells. One of them was the positional spell, Positional Vortex. It was a spell that used an array to create a vortex of power. The other was Phantom Vortex. As the name suggested, it was a movement spell. Just now, He Zhanghai used the Phantom Vortex secret spell to take away the star map lock from Kang Shinmu and Moya. Now, the secret spell that He Zhanghai used to deal with Kang Shinmu was the Positional Vortex. Kang Shinmu avoided the attack of the Positional Vortex so easily, so he could not help but think that Gufeng's power had already fallen into Kang Shinmu's hands. Back in the Wuxia Pavilion, Gufeng had taken a fancy to the Positional Vortex secret spell, so she took it away and imprisoned it on the magic tool Bloodstain. The bloodstain itself was soaked in the power of the Crimson Flame Qilin's bloodline. Coupled with the Positional Vortex, its combat power soared. He Zhanghai had thought that Gufeng had disappeared to search for new treasures in the mystic realm. After all, Gufeng loved all the treasures in the arcane realm. Even if someone else had already dug them out, she still wanted to get her hands on them. Now, it seemed that Gufeng's disappearance was definitely related to this kid in front of him. You mean the bloodstains? Kang Shinmu did not avoid anything. He moved away and said calmly. The moment He Zhanghai unleashed the vortex field, Kang Shinmu sensed the nature of this secret technique. It was similar to the field spell released by Gufeng's blood scar. The only difference was that the two used different methods of release. After defeating Gufeng, although Kang Shinmu did not intend to refine the bloodstains, he still checked the hidden power within them. Naturally, Kang Shinmu had also learned a thing or two about the position-type spells in the blood scar. Now that he was facing He Zhanghai's formation whirlpool, he had the strength to resist it. Kang Shinmu's every move was within He Zhanghai's grasp. His reaction proved that Gufeng's disappearance was related to him. Where's Gufeng? He Zhanghai was on the other side of the secret realm. When he heard Dan Yuanfei's call, he rushed back. He did not know the details of what had happened here. When Kang Shinmu heard that, his eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not say anything. Not talking? Then you know where she is. Tell me, and I will spare your life. He Zhanghai believed that Gufeng was strong, and she had the Nangong family's bloodline inheritance. It would not be a problem for her to deal with a wandering cultivator like Kang Xinmu. Gu Feng's disappearance could only be attributed to Kang Xinmu's opportunism. He did not defeat her with his real strength. The moment the two of them confronted each other, the surrounding space ramparts suddenly moved. Several entrances to the space ramparts rushed in this direction. They suddenly merged and expanded, forming a giant space rampart. It was not just this place. The other space ramparts in other places were also merging. In a few breaths, all the space ramparts in the entire cave had merged. In this way, the entire cave was enveloped by the space ramparts. The cave had become its own space. All the cultivators who came later would only be able to enter this new space. Moreover, this time, they could only enter and not leave. Only cultivators who had stepped into the Gate of Rules could use the power of rules to break through the shackles of the space ramparts. Only then could they leave. The essence of the space rampart was a rampart formed by the flame of the dead spirits. The dead spirits' rampart completely enveloped the entire cave. In other words, the entire cave was a kind of dead spirits' rampart. Everywhere would emit the aura of the flame of the dead spirits. The power released by the dead spirits' rampart on such a large scale caused the 8-god star plate to form a connection. The 8-god star plate began to shake. What is that thing? Soon, He Zhanghai discovered the 8-god star plate's aura. He narrowed his eyes and stared at Kang Xinmu. Kang Xinmu did not hold back. Since the 8-god star plate was connected to the surrounding space ramparts, he took out the 8-god star plate. Once the 8-god star plate appeared, it floated in the air, absorbing the aura of the dead spirits in the surrounding space. Star Devourer. He Zhanghai recognized it. It was Hai Fan's summoning artifact, Star Devourer. The cruel truth was already in front of him, so there was no need to say anything more. He Zhanghai did not hold back anymore. His first reaction was to gather his strength to retrieve the 8-god star plate. However, he did not expect that the 8-god star plate would reflect his strength. Everyone in the Everlasting Pavilion knew that Hai Fan had a summoning artifact, Star Devourer, that could summon creatures from the other world. In the Everlasting Pavilion, there were also some summoning artifacts that could summon creatures from the other world. Therefore, they did not know much about Star Devourer. After touching it, He Zhanghai realized that Star Devourer was actually the 8-god star plate. 8-god star plate. He Zhanghai said word by word. Star Devourer was the artifact of the disciples of the Everlasting Pavilion, so he had to get it back. Moreover, he had to get the 8-god star plate back. He Zhanghai glanced at Emoya and attacked again. This time, He Zhanghai released the Phantom Whirlpool's secret technique. Kang Xinmu naturally could not capture He Zhanghai, who was using the Phantom Whirlpool's secret technique. Just as he was about to condense the Dharma seal and Dharma power, he accidentally caught a glimpse of the 8-god star plate. The 8-god star plate took the initiative to attack. Although he could not see where He Zhanghai was, he could use the 8-god star plate to determine He Zhanghai's position. Moreover, no matter where He Zhanghai went, the 8-god star plate's attack would automatically follow. He Zhanghai never expected that his Phantom Whirlpool would be broken by the 8-god star plate. He was furious. The 8-god star plate could only be his. This made He Zhanghai even more determined to fight for the 8-god star plate. The 8-god star plate absorbed the breath of dead spirits in the surrounding space, and the entire artifact gradually returned to its original appearance. In time, as long as he found the lost base, this artifact could be considered the real 8-god star plate. After absorbing the breath of dead spirits around him, Kang Xinmu kept the 8-god star plate. He Zhanghai chased after him and got entangled with Kang Xinmu. The deterrence of their soul consciousness was very strong. When they collided with each other, it formed a barrier in the surrounding space, blocking everything from the outside world. Chapter 57-27. Inside the soul consciousness barrier, both He Zhanghai and Kang Xinmu were giving it their all. Hand over the 8-god star plate. He Zhanghai's eyes seemed to be covered by a layer of gray shadow. This layer of gray shadow kept changing as He Zhanghai spoke. Kang Xinmu could sense that this gray shadow was the Phantom Vortex secret technique. What He Zhanghai used just now was just the tip of the iceberg. He had not used the real Phantom Vortex yet, but he had used the Formation Vortex first. Kang Xinmu had already seen Gu Feng's formation technique, so he could make a simple solution to the Formation Vortex. However, as the gray shadow in He Zhanghai's eyes deepened, the surrounding Formation Vortex underwent a qualitative change. From the outside, it felt like the surrounding space had not changed at all, but was full of traps. As long as he moved slightly, he could trigger a chain attack from the Formation Vortex, and he would not be able to react in time. Kang Xinmu's guess was right. He could not move now. It was not just Kang Xinmu. If it were anyone else, no matter how strong the cultivator was, they would trigger the Formation Vortex secret technique if they entered the Formation Vortex. Once the Formation Vortex was triggered, they would not only face the restraints of the formation, but also the attacks from the Phantom Vortex. He Zhanghai's mastery of the Phantom Vortex had broken through the boundary. Not only could he use this secret technique with the Formation Vortex, but he could also use the Phantom Vortex as an offensive technique. Kang Xinmu did not move, but He Zhanghai would not let him get what he wanted. He Zhanghai controlled one of the formation bases and quickly approached Kang Xinmu. It seemed like he had moved the formation base, but in fact, he had moved the space where the formation base was. In other words, it was equivalent to Kang Xinmu moving his body. Kang Xinmu was constantly paying attention to the surrounding formation bases. When He Zhanghai controlled the formation base, Kang Xinmu wanted to kill He Zhanghai on the spot. If the conditions allowed, he would not hesitate to kill He Zhanghai. Brat, the 8-god star plate doesn't belong to you. Quickly hand it over before you die. He Zhanghai frowned and said coldly. What are you saying? Regardless of whether I am dead or alive, you want the 8-god star plate. Why do you need to ask so much? Kang Xinmu raised his eyebrows and said faintly. That's true. He Zhanghai coldly laughed and unleashed his unparalleled godly strength. For a moment, something like a spider web fell from the sky and trapped Kang Xinmu. Before the object even came close, Kang Xinmu could already feel the pressure coming from it. Moreover, as this thing approached, he could clearly sense that the power in his chi meridian was stagnating, and even flowing in reverse. This was He Zhanghai's supreme divine power, the supreme divine power that accompanied his supreme domain power. As a result, the moment this power poured out, even his soul and consciousness were affected. Kang Xinmu directly controlled the dermic seal and released the power of the dermic might. The moment the spider web came crashing down, Kang Xinmu used the power of the dermic might. What surprised Kang Xinmu was that after releasing the power of the dermic might, he did not teleport away as he had imagined. Instead, he was still standing in the same place. Seeing the spider web coming towards him, Kang Xinmu once again gathered the power of the dermic might. At this moment, He Zhanghai's face was terrifyingly gloomy. The spider web had already reached him, but it directly penetrated Kang Xinmu's body. No, it didn't penetrate. When the spider web passed by, Kang Xinmu's body did not feel the slightest bit of discomfort. After focusing his mind to examine it again, Kang Xinmu suddenly realized something. The power of the dermic might that he had used had brought him to a parallel space with the spider web, so its attack naturally missed. This scene caused He Zhanghai to be stunned. Was this the power of the dermic seal? Or the power of the dermic might? In the end, he had underestimated this brat. He Zhanghai's hand gestures changed rapidly, and the spider web in the space suddenly disappeared. Kaboom! Then, a series of explosions sounded in the space, followed by a gray aura that quickly filled the space. Being in a parallel space, Kang Xinmu could also feel the pressure brought by this gray aura. Moreover, when this gray aura approached him, it was obvious that the space was being eroded. You've only grasped a little bit of it. Do you really think this will save your life? He Zhanghai grinned hideously. His figure had already arrived at Kang Shinmu's side, and a swift and fierce palm attack followed. The palm attack carried a strong gust of wind, which was the supreme wind force. Including the gray aura that permeated the palm attack, it was the supreme thunder force. Just by looking at the gray aura, it was difficult to associate it with the thunder attribute. Moreover, this gray aura also had an extremely strong corrosive ability, which was a far cry from the thunder attribute. However, when Kang Shinmu faced this power, it was obvious that it had the thunder attribute. He had come into contact with the Supreme Thunder Force in the past, so he was not unfamiliar with the Supreme Thunder Force. The reason why He Zhanghai's Supreme Thunder Force looked like this was most likely due to the influence of his secret skill. The combination of the Formation Vortex and the Phantom Vortex could enhance the Supreme Divine Power to a certain extent. It was extremely unwise to fight head-on knowing that he could not win, so Kang Shinmu decisively chose to retreat. After a few rounds, He Zhanghai's expression became even uglier. Kang Shinmu was no match for him at all, but it was true that he could not catch Kang Shinmu's figure. There were a few times when he was about to catch Kang Shinmu, but Kang Shinmu was always able to dodge at the crucial moment by relying on the power of the dermic seal. Do you only know how to run? He Zhanghai's Phantom Vortex was a movement type of secret skill. When this secret skill was mastered, it could also allow one to travel freely in the corresponding space. He Zhanghai possessed the Supreme Thunder Force and the Supreme Wind Force. Combining these two types of supreme divine power, he could even be unafraid of space storms. He Zhanghai had already mastered the Phantom Vortex long ago, so it was naturally not a problem for him to deal with some superficial space techniques of Kang Shinmu. However, he was unable to use the power of the Phantom Vortex in this place. At this moment, the cave abode had already been covered by the space rampart. It was equivalent to the evolved space rampart becoming the boundary of the cave abode. Under the effect of the evolved space rampart, the cave abode had become a self-contained space that could only be entered and not exited. Before the space rampart had fully evolved, some cultivators with powerful cultivation could still leave the cave abode. Now that the space rampart had fully evolved, even a cultivator with level 9 Supreme Divine Power might not be able to leave. He Zhanghai's Supreme Divine Power had already reached level 9 and was infinitely close to the Gate of Rules. When he used his Supreme Divine Power, he could feel the pressure brought by the space rampart. This was also why he could not use the Phantom Vortex secret skill. With this kind of pressure, all the cultivators here would be restricted in all aspects. When He Zhanghai realized this, he also thought that Kang Shinmu would be pressured. However, after a round of teaching, He Zhanghai began to doubt his previous speculation. Chapter 57-28. He Zhanghai's eyes were fixed on Kang Shinmu as he released his soul consciousness to surround Kang Shinmu. After trying for a while, he was still unable to find out anything about Kang Shinmu. On the contrary, Kang Shinmu gave off an unfathomable aura. Moreover, Kang Shinmu easily avoided his supreme lightning and supreme wind power. Kang Shinmu's own supreme god power was at most at the 8th level. With his 9th stage supreme divine strength, how could he not be a match for an 8th stage supreme divine strength? While He Zhanghai was sizing up Kang Shinmu was also sizing up He Zhanghai. Relying on his powerful soul consciousness, Kang Shinmu was basically sure that He Zhanghai only had 2 types of supreme god power, supreme wind power and supreme lightning power. These 2 types of supreme god power had already reached the 9th level. Although the space barrier here had a kind of restriction on his power, combined with the position vortex and phantom vortex, He Zhanghai's power could still reach the height it should have. Kang Shinmu was also clear about the effect the evolved space barrier would have on the entire cave abode. Since he possessed the flame of the dead spirits and had already absorbed the flame of the dead spirits, his supreme divine flame had already evolved into the supreme divine flame. The essence of the space barrier was the flame of dead souls. With the supreme god flame, he would not be restricted by the space barrier. Kang Shinmu took advantage of this advantage to accurately control his power and take the initiative to attack He Zhanghai. The battle between the two gradually entered the space barrier. Coupled with the existence of He Zhanghai's position vortex, the two were completely separated from the cave abode. No matter what the situation of the battle between the two was, all the cultivators who entered the cave abode were unaware of it. This included Emoya. Although the battle was not far from her, she could not see the situation clearly. The only thing she could be sure of was that Kang Shinmu was not restricted by the space barrier. What Emoya was worried about was Kang Shinmu's supreme godly strength. Although Kang Shinmu's peerless divine strength had reached the 8th stage, compared to the 9th stage, the difference was like heaven and earth. It was not something that could be dealt with treasures. Moreover, sensing the subtle changes in the space in front of her, the thing that Emoya was worried about had come. Ever since Kang Shinmu stepped into the Supreme God stage, the first Supreme God power he chose to cultivate was the power of the Supreme God Flame. After that, he relied on actual combat and the continuous devouring of unparalleled divine power, allowing his unparalleled divine fire power to advance rapidly. Now, the peerless godly flame of the 8th level had completely absorbed the power of the flame of the undead spirits and evolved into a peerless godly flame. Although the supreme divine spirit flame belonged to the supreme divine powers, it was far stronger than other supreme divine powers of the same level. Obtaining this power meant that his power had changed, and he would have to undergo a lightning tribulation. Now, the subtle changes in the space that Emoya sensed were the signs of a tribulation. Kang Shinmu needed to go into seclusion and continuously refine before he could fully grasp the power of the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame. Going into seclusion was a stage that every cultivator had to go through in order to advance their power. But now was not the time. If he was even slightly distracted now, he might encounter an unforeseen calamity. The thing that Emoya was worried about happened to Kang Shinmu. When Kang Shinmu displayed the Supreme Divine Spirit Flame just now, he sensed the changes in the meridians in his body. This feeling was that he was about to undergo a tribulation. The fluctuations in the aura around him also fell into He Zhanghai's perception. He Zhanghai laughed sinisterly. Kid, looks like even the heavens aren't willing to help you. Tribulation transcendence was something that cultivators looked forward to very much. As long as they went through a tribulation, it meant that their power would increase. But in this case, the tribulation might turn into a life and death tribulation. If they could withstand the pressure from He Zhanghai and successfully undergo the tribulation, they would survive. If they couldn't withstand the pressure and failed the tribulation, they would die. Kang Shinmu definitely wouldn't choose to undergo the tribulation at this time, but reality didn't allow it. His tribulation had come. Without hesitation, Kang Shinmu released the 8 God Star Plate, summoning Lu Zi and Big Guy. Thank you for your trouble. After saying that, Kang Shinmu sat down on the ground. The moment he sat down, layers of dark green flames appeared around him, surrounding his entire body. An aura that alternated between hot and cold suddenly spread out. Yes, Master. Lu Zi and Big Guy weren't strangers to He Zhanghai at all. Do you think you can stop me? He Zhanghai glanced at Lu Zi and Big Guy disdainfully. With that, he defeated the two of them. After quickly defeating the two, He Zhanghai quickly approached Kang Shinmu. Just as he was about to attack Kang Shinmu, he felt the pressure of the Supreme Divine Flame. It was clearly an 8th level Supreme Divine Power, but it was suppressing his 9th level Supreme Divine Power. This feeling made He Zhanghai very unhappy. Activating his soul consciousness, he condensed the 2 Supreme Divine Powers and approached Kang Shinmu. Unfortunately, when these 2 Supreme Divine Powers approached Kang Shinmu, they were blocked by the dark green aura surrounding Kang Shinmu. He Zhanghai naturally refused to believe it. A trivial 8th stage Supreme Divine Force, how could it block his 9th stage Supreme Divine Force? Furthermore, his peerless power of wind and peerless power of lightning were peerless saint attribute divine powers. Kang Shinmu's Supreme Divine Fire power was just a very ordinary Supreme Divine power. Even if it advanced, its essence would not change, so there was nothing to fear. Thinking so, He Zhanghai once again used his supreme divine power to deal with Kang Shinmu, who was meditating on the ground. This time, he approached Kang Shinmu, but all his attacks failed. Only then did he realize that Kang Shinmu had entered the spatial barrier. With the protection of the spatial barrier, he could not approach him. The power of magic had brought Kang Shinmu into the spatial barrier, so Kang Shinmu was naturally aware of it. Not only that, but he also controlled his power and quietly brought Emoya into the spatial barrier. He did not know how long it would take for him to transcend this tribulation, so he could not let Emoya be threatened. Kang Shinmu and Emoya both entered the spatial barrier. The 8-god star plate also followed Kang Shinmu into the spatial barrier. Lu Zi and the big guy were not He Zhanghai's opponents. After being defeated, they returned through the contract gate. He Zhanghai tried to use the 8-god star plate to enter the spatial barrier, but he saw that the contract gate was not closed. Immediately after, a shadow swept out from within. The aura this shadow exuded was very powerful. Although it was a creature from the other world, the strength of the cultivation it exuded was far beyond that of a supreme cultivator. He Zhanghai instinctively became vigilant. The shadow that swept out of the contract gate was Shenguang. Shenguang sensed that the environment of the 8-god star plate had changed dramatically, so he came out to check. Only then did he realize that the 8-god star plate had actually entered this spatial barrier. Shenguang was naturally not unfamiliar with spatial barriers. However, he knew very well that the person who created this spatial barrier was not the dead spirit clan of the other world's 4 great corpse ancestor clans. The caster's technique was even more brilliant. Moreover, the spatial barrier he created was filled with rules. Chapter 57-29. He Zhanghai had never seen Shenguang before, but he could faintly feel that the aura around Shenguang was very strong, very close to the 9th level of Divine Force realm. Star Eater was Everlasting Pavilion's disciple Hai Fan's summoning instrument. It wasn't that he didn't know Hai Fan, and he knew a thing or two about Hai Fan. Other than Big Head and Lu Zi, Hai Fan often summoned a creature from the other world called Cruel. Cruel was very strong, stronger than most of the Everlasting Pavilion's elders. He originally thought that Cruel was the strongest creature from the other world that Star Eater had signed a contract with. Unexpectedly, he saw a creature from the other world that was even stronger than Cruel. Shenguang. Shenguang glanced at He Zhanghai and said calmly. Shenguang. He Zhanghai's expression changed. He Zhanghai had heard of Shenguang before. Shenguang was the nightmare of the 4 ancestor corpse clans from the other world. 10,000 years ago in the other world, there was a huge event that shocked the entire world. It was a taboo existence in the other world. After that, the 4 ancestor corpse clans were divided. The person who caused that event was called Shenguang. This was something that He Zhanghai had heard when he was roaming the world. As for whether or not this Shenguang was that Shenguang, he couldn't prove his identity with just one sentence. He Zhanghai calmed his emotions and focused, once again sizing up Shenguang's cultivation. The aura that leaked out on the surface was indeed only at the 9th level of Divine Force realm. It wasn't enough to become the nightmare of the other world. Shenguang glanced at Kang Shinmu. Seeing that there was the aura of rules circulating around Kang Shinmu, he was surprised. After not seeing him for a while, Kang Shinmu's cultivation had actually reached such a level. His talent was really not bad. Kang Shinmu was currently in seclusion, and he didn't know what was happening in the outside world at all. As the power in his meridians circulated, his soul consciousness gradually condensed around his body. With the power of the seal, he formed a boundary, covering his entire body. Kang Shinmu was worried about Emoya, so he used his magical power to form a boundary to protect her. The moment the magical power was released, Shenguang's sharp senses sensed it. This was the magical power of the Star Atlas Lock, a kind of natural force. Once Kang Shinmu stepped into the Gate of Laws, it would signify that he would possess the power of the natural laws, the power of space. In other words, it was a type of space law. When that time came, as long as he grasped the space law seal, it would not be an exaggeration to say that no one would have a higher attainment than him in the aspect of space law. The moment the boundary formed by his soul consciousness enveloped Kang Shinmu, He Zhanghai sensed the existence of magic power. At this moment, He Zhanghai's face was terrifyingly gloomy. He thought that this kid Kang Shinmu was able to break through the power of the dermic might purely because he had the advantage of the dermic seal. At most, he was just trying his luck to break through the power of the dermic might. Unexpectedly, Kang Shinmu has mastered the power of dermic powers. Since that was the case, the second son must be eliminated. He Zhanghai unreservedly released his own power, causing the surrounding spatial barrier to tremble. The originally stable spatial barrier gradually began to operate due to the influence of He Zhanghai's power. Although the speed was very slow, the laws contained within it also began to operate. The laws of the spatial barrier began to operate, which meant that from this moment on, all cultivators who entered the cave abode had to abide by the laws of the spatial barrier. Otherwise, they would be lost within the laws of the spatial barrier. When the laws of the spatial barrier operated, many cultivators violated the laws and were sucked into it, getting lost within the spatial barrier. The spatial barrier was like a kind of boundary, separating the space of the cave abode from the outside world. This did not mean that the laws of the spatial barrier were absolute. Once this law was broken, they might face an even greater danger. In any space, once it was torn apart, the spatial storm within it would constantly emerge. The spatial storm was the strongest and most dangerous existence within the space. He Zhanghai did not care about anything and was determined to take down Kang Shinmu. However, he underestimated the boundary around Kang Shinmu. Moreover, this boundary seemed to be gradually strengthening. As Kang Shinmu's tribulation progressed, the boundary around him would only become stronger. He Zhanghai's eyes narrowed, and his hand gestures quickly changed. There were complex runes flashing from between his eyebrows. Some of the runes had already been imprinted on the boundary around Kang Shinmu. At this moment, the boundary clearly trembled a little. Seeing this, He Zhanghai sneered, "Do you really think that this level of boundary can protect you?" "You are." Shen Guang's eyes stared straight at the runes imprinted on the boundary. These runes exuded a powerful decomposing power, which was disintegrating the boundary. As the boundary trembled, the runes on it seemed to be growing stronger. No, the runes not only disintegrated the boundary, but also devoured the disintegrated part of the boundary to strengthen the power of the runes, which in turn accelerated the speed of decomposition. In this way, the boundary would be completely decomposed by the runes sooner or later. Moreover, by decomposing the runes of the boundary and devouring the power of the boundary, it would also become stronger. Although Kang Shinmu's boundary was continuously strengthening and the power of the runes was also increasing, it was very disadvantageous to Kang Shinmu. Shen Guang originally wanted to erase the runes on the boundary, but he found that his power had no effect on the runes. Instead, the runes seemed to have absorbed his power. "These runes are from the other world." Seeing Shen Guang's action, He Zhanghai sneered. His meaning was already very clear. Let Shen Guang not waste his energy, otherwise, it would only accelerate the speed of decomposition of Kang Shinmu's boundary. Shen Guang retracted his hand gestures, but he was still somewhat unwilling. Just as he was in a dilemma, he suddenly saw a beautiful figure sweep to Kang Shinmu's side. A pair of slender hands changed into a very common seal, which was a common seal gesture for erasing. After doing all this, Moya's lily-white hands gently pressed on the boundary. The runes on the boundary all became transparent, and then disappeared. Moya actually erased the runes on the boundary. Shen Guang couldn't help but take another look at Moya. This woman had always been by the side of the 8 God Star Plates owner, Kang Shinmu. This was the first time he saw her ability. Moya's erasing technique was very simple, and Shen Guang and He Zhanghai knew it too. Shen Guang couldn't erase the runes, but Moya did it. The difference was in the two's supreme divine power. Moya's supreme divine power was supreme holy power. Using this power and her own technique, it was indeed easy to erase the runes. Worthy of being the person that I like. He Zhanghai was slightly surprised by the fact that Emoya possessed supreme divine power. Of course, Emoya only used her power to help Kang Shinmu erase the runes, which made He Zhanghai very angry. In the end, He Zhanghai transferred all his resentment to Kang Shinmu. You really talk a lot of nonsense. Emoya's beautiful eyes focused, and she finally looked at He Zhanghai. In her beautiful eyes, there were waves of white mist surging. Then, Emoya's lily-white hands changed into another seal, and a rune-like pattern appeared under her feet. This pattern looked simple, but it was a pattern that He Zhanghai had never seen before. The next moment, a similar pattern appeared under He Zhanghai's feet. Immediately, He Zhanghai felt that his movement was restricted. His attacks couldn't rush out of the range of the pattern. Moreover, there was the restriction of the space barrier here, which completely restricted He Zhanghai's movement. Without any reason, Emoya used a teleportation technique on He Zhanghai. What kind of technique is this? He Zhanghai had naturally seen teleportation techniques before. They were techniques that used space to change the target's position. However, this was the first time he had seen a teleportation technique like Emoya's. Before he could get a response, he was teleported away. Chapter 57:30. Xinguang was a being from the other world. Although Emoya had never dealt with Xinguang before, she knew that he was a contracted being from the 8-god star plate. Knowing Xinguang's general situation, Xinguang's combat power far surpassed Kang Shinmu's. Emoya was still afraid of Xinguang. Xinguang seemed to have read her mind, so he moved to the side. He didn't say much. He didn't explicitly say that he would protect Kang Shinmu during his tribulation, nor did he plan to return to the other world. He just stood there quietly. He Zhanghai had only been moved by Emoya. He quickly found the route that Emoya had moved and returned the way he had come. Returning the way he had come wouldn't trigger the rules of the space barrier and wouldn't be affected by the rules. Seeing He Zhanghai appear again, Emoya's beautiful eyes narrowed. This guy seemed to be much more difficult to deal with than she had imagined. Miss, I won't hurt you. However, if you insist on protecting that kid, I might hurt you. He Zhanghai's tone was humble and polite when he faced Emoya. Excuse me. As soon as he said that, several runes flew out of He Zhanghai's body again. The runes that appeared this time didn't look much different from the previous ones. What troubled Emoya was that she couldn't erase these runes this time. Moreover, He Zhanghai didn't hold back this time. He released 2 types of supreme divine powers. As the peerless power of wind and peerless power of thunder fused together, there seemed to be some sort of nomological power mixed within. Such a powerful force directly attacked the boundary around Kang Shinmu. Emoya didn't dare to be careless. She hurriedly gathered supreme divine power. Since she couldn't erase the other's power, she could at least weaken it. However, Xinguang was faster than her. He dashed forward and blocked the attack with his bare hands. Immediately, an extremely powerful force exploded from Xinguang's body and swept toward He Zhanghai. The 2 forces were similar in strength. Thus, they were in a stalemate, forming a relatively static state. Emoya's beautiful eyes stared at the place where the 2 forces collided. The small space formed by the static state didn't just open the door to the other world. It also opened the door to other worlds. Vaguely, Emoya felt a mysterious and familiar force. The static state only lasted for a moment before it was broken. Both of them took a few steps back, and soon, they were engaged in a fight. At that moment, within the boundary, Kang Shinmu, who was undergoing his tribulation, also felt an aura that was different from the other world. It was an extremely unfamiliar aura, but it was the 7 devouring demon sealing art seal. The seal of the 7 devouring demon sealing art, which had been in a closed state all this time, suddenly opened at this moment, and then released a devouring power. The devouring power released by the 7 devouring demon sealing art swept out in all directions. This was an invisible power, and Jiang Shenwu could only sense its existence with his soul consciousness. With his current soul consciousness, he could only sense the devouring power released by the 7 devouring devil sealing art spreading out and condensing at the point where he Zhanghai's and the divine light's powers collided. Following the brief pause of this devouring power, Jiang Shenwu could clearly sense that the aura of the remnant of the 7 devouring devil sealing art had grown a bit stronger. Vaguely, it seemed like it was going to advance. Now, Kang Xinmu was sure that the brief moment when Guang and He Zhanghai's powers collided was a door to another world. Other than the other world, there must be a higher world. In that world, there were many rules. Although the door had only opened for a moment, it was still captured by the 7 devouring demon sealing arts seal. It activated and released the 7 devouring demon sealing arts devouring power, absorbing all the rules. After absorbing the rules behind the door, the first level of the 7 devouring demon sealing arts seal became more stable. The door closed after Guang and He Zhanghai fought again. However, the 7 devouring demon sealing arts devouring power didn't retract. Instead, it continued to spread forward. Kang Xinmu released more of his Guang. He released the 7 devouring demon sealing arts devouring power. Not long after, the 7 devouring demon sealing arts devouring power approached the space barrier. After coming into contact with the space barrier, it seemed to sense the rules it contained. It spread along the space barrier at a speed that Kang Xinmu's Guang couldn't capture. This cave abode wasn't big, but it was affected by the space barrier. It expanded infinitely. Kang Xinmu's Guang couldn't cover the entire cave abode with his Guang. Since his Guang couldn't capture the 7 devouring demon sealing arts devouring power, Kang Xinmu didn't retract his Guang. Instead, he focused on his surroundings. The mysterious cultivator who set up the space barrier was definitely still in this space. He couldn't be careless. In reality, the mysterious cultivator who set up the space barrier was the white figure that Kang Xinmu saw when he entered the cave abode. His name was Hao Yan, and he was a disciple of the Shaoyun sect. He was also in the cave abode. Hao Yan moved the cave abode to the surface and released the space barrier. He wanted to refine the cave abode into a spatial artifact. He didn't move the cave abode to this place randomly. It was within his calculations. The place he chose was where the door to the parallel world was. Hao Yan's goal was to open that door and use the rules of the space barrier to refine a spatial artifact that could lead to the alternate world. In other words, it was an artifact that was similar to the star map lock. This kind of artifact was different from the star map lock. The star map lock was limited by the wielder's cultivation and the wielder's soul consciousness. It could also be understood that the distance or the degree of space that the star map lock could teleport was limited by the wielder's soul consciousness. The artifact that Hao Yan refined didn't have such a rule. As long as one understood the rules of the space barrier, one could control the artifact. Hao Yan sensed the devouring power released by Kang Xinmu's 7 devouring demon sealing art when it spread through the space barrier. However, Hao Yan was currently trying to open the door to the alternate world, so he couldn't leave for a while. Ever since Hao Yan entered the cave abode, he had changed the space barrier's layout several times just to open that door. For some reason, he could only sense the door, but he couldn't open it. This state continued for a period of time. Suddenly, Hao Yan sensed an extremely powerful force spreading through the spatial barrier. Then, the door opened. Although it only opened for a moment, Hao Yan seized the opportunity. He controlled his power, opened the door, and entered. He Zhanghai and the power of the divine light continued to collide, but the special door didn't open again. After Hao Yan entered the door, it meant that he had left the cave abode and the space barrier. The devouring power engraved by the 7 devouring demon sealing art circled the entire space barrier once before quickly withdrawing. The devouring power of the 7 devouring demon sealing art had already devoured all the rules of the space barrier. As for how strong the rules of the space barrier were, Kang Xinmu didn't have a clear idea. It wasn't until now that the 7 devouring demon sealing art had devoured these rules that he successfully entered the second stage. Only then did Kang Shinmu realize how strong the rules of the space barrier were. Chapter 57:31. The spatial barrier that had lost its laws still existed. Although the laws within it had been devoured, the spatial barrier was still a type of spatial spell technique. Without the restrictions of the laws, it had completely transformed into an ordinary spatial spell technique. The cultivators who had entered by mistake were no longer restricted by the laws. They only needed to break the spatial barrier to leave this cave abode. However, Hao Yan's spatial barrier technique had evolved from the flame of dead spirits. Apart from the spatial storm, there was also the flame of dead spirits in the damaged space. There were even some living beings from the other world sealed in certain places, such as some clansmen of the corpse ancestor clan. Many cultivators had already encountered the clansmen of the corpse ancestor clan. Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness had also sensed the many cultivators who had entered the spatial barrier by mistake. This time, he had finally witnessed what it meant by there were as many supreme cultivators as there were hairs on a cow. What was certain was that most of the cultivators who had come here were cultivators from other realms. Compared to these cultivators, Kang Shinmu had more or less a rough estimate of the Everlasting Pavilion's deterrent power. The Everlasting Pavilion was not something that he could contend with on his own. The only thing he could do now was to successfully transcend the tribulation. The moment his soul consciousness was released, the power of the supreme holy ice domain that had been dormant in his sea of consciousness for a long time was also released. It gradually merged with the barrier around Kang Shinmu's body, completely isolating Kang Shinmu from the outside world. From the outside world's perspective, Kang Shinmu was sitting on the ground, motionless. The aura around him was also in a state of stillness. On the other hand, Kang Shinmu was situated in a white world. This aura was the power of the supreme holy ice domain. During the tribulation, he had unintentionally released the supreme holy ice domain. There was also the power of nature mixed with the power of space. These two types of powers that Kang Shinmu could not control were released at the same time, which indeed surprised Kang Shinmu. Although surprised, Kang Shinmu seized the time to refine these powers. Under the effect of these two powers, the seal began to become more complete and approached Kang Shinmu's supreme power. The seal that was originally the core of the star map was limited to controlling the power of space. At this moment, as Kang Shinmu's power of space and the power of the supreme holy ice domain continued to evolve, it also began to change. The power of the star map core seal had completely transformed into the power of the seal with the power of space. This also meant that Kang Shinmu had mastered the power of space. Although he had only grasped the basics of the supreme spatial force, Jiang Shenwu was still able to fully unleash the power of the supreme spatial force with the power of the seal. As for the power of the supreme holy domain, it was a power of supreme power of space. This was the power that Jiang Shenwu had devoured when a holy artifact of heaven and earth had perished. Since he had not grasped the power of the supreme holy ice, he could not unleash the power of the supreme holy ice domain. As Kang Shinmu mastered the power of space, the power of the supreme holy ice domain gradually merged with the power of space. As Kang Shinmu mastered the power of space, the power of the supreme holy ice domain gradually merged with it. This was actually not a good thing for Kang Shinmu. If the power of the supreme holy ice domain merged with the power of space, then he, who had mastered the power of the supreme holy ice, would not be able to condense the power of the supreme holy ice domain. When that happened, the power of the supreme holy ice domain that had merged with the power of space would also affect the condensation of the power of the supreme holy ice domain. This was what Kang Shinmu was worried about. However, this did not stop the fusion of the two powers. As he released his consciousness, the speed at which the two powers merged increased. Very soon, Kang Shinmu realized something. Although the power of the supreme holy ice domain and the power of space had merged, he could still sense the existence of these two powers. The power of the fusion was affected by the seal. After the two powers merged, it was equivalent to producing a new power. This power was essentially the power of the seal. Although Kang Shinmu could use the power of space, he still could not comprehend the power of the Supreme Holy Ice. This also meant that he could not control the power of the Supreme Holy Ice domain. After mastering the power of space, Kang Shinmu had a rough understanding of his own power. The first power that he comprehended was the power of the Supreme Divine Fire. The power of the Supreme Divine Fire was also the first power that was close to the 9th level. Later on, under the effect of the flame of dead spirits, it evolved into the Supreme Spiritual Fire. The Supreme Flame of Divinity stopped at the 9th level and didn't advance any further. Even though Kang Shinmu absorbed the power of fire in the universe, the Supreme Spiritual Fire did not improve at all. On the contrary, the power of the Supreme Holy Land, the power of the Supreme Dark Iron, the power of the Supreme Soul, and the power of space that he had just comprehended started to improve. All this while, Kang Shinmu mainly cultivated the power of the Supreme Divine Fire and neglected to cultivate these powers. Until now, when the Supreme Spiritual Fire reached the 9th level, it stopped. The remaining Supreme Divine Power began to absorb the natural power of the Supreme Divine Power in the world, as well as the corresponding elemental power in the surrounding space. After a type of power reached the 9th level, theoretically, it would gradually come into contact with the rules, and cross the door of rules to explore the rules corresponding to the power of nature. Then, it would step into the realm of rules. However, until now, Kang Shinmu's Supreme Spiritual Fire did not improve at all. Kang Shinmu had never heard of such a situation, let alone experienced it himself. He could not help but think of a possibility. He would only step into the realm of laws when all of his supreme godly powers reached the 9th level. If that was really the case, he would face another problem. He possessed more than a dozen types of supreme divine powers, and he only needed to cultivate all of them to the 9th level. Or could it be that there were still other types of supreme divine powers? It seemed that after reaching the supreme level, the system he cultivated gradually changed. Could it be that he was affected by the power of the Supreme Holy Ice territory? Or was it affected by the power of devouring? As for the answer to this question, Kang Shinmu did not know. What he needed to do now was to refine the other types of power. Only then would he be able to get an accurate answer. Time passed just like that. Kang Shinmu's tribulation continued. Just like that, a year passed. In a year, the boundary around Kang Shinmu became stronger and stronger. Not only did the boundary protect Kang Shinmu, but it also protected Imoya tightly. Kang Shinmu spent a year in seclusion while he Zhanghai and the Divine Light fought for a year. After a year, there was still no clear winner between the two. No one was more surprised than he Zhanghai. The living beings of the other world use their own power to pass through the door. Staying here for a long time will only weaken your power. How can you still have power? He Zhanghai could not understand this. Chapter 5732. He Zhanghai narrowed his eyes and did not respond to the Divine Light directly. In a year, Divine Light had more or less figured out He Zhanghai's background. He had the same bloodline inheritance as Gufeng, which was the power of replication. Not long ago, it once again displayed its regenerative ability. The regenerative ability was not a kind of supreme divine power. Just like the replication ability, it was a special power inherited from the bloodline that was comparable to supreme divine power. However, the regenerative ability came from the lost clan, the Yuan family. Although they were both great hidden families, compared to the Nangong family, there was no information about the Yuan family in the world. The Yuan family was like a family that only existed in legends. No one knew where they were and no one had any traces of the Yuan family. Of course, there might be descendants of the Yuan family in this world, but under normal circumstances, no one would be able to discover them. One thing that could be confirmed was that the regenerative ability originated from the Yuan family. It was an inherited power of the Yuan family. However, the ability to regenerate was not inherited from the Yuan family's bloodline. As for what kind of power was inherited from the Yuan family's bloodline, there was no relevant explanation in later generations. What was certain was that the regenerative ability was an inherited power. Therefore, even if the Yuan family was hidden somewhere in the world, they would still find a suitable candidate to inherit the regenerative ability. He Zhanghai possessed the ability to regenerate, so he might be the successor of the Yuan family. In other words, He Zhanghai had someone who could contact the Yuan family. Why are you protecting that person? He Zhanghai paused and asked. Answer my question first. Shenguang glanced at Kang Xinmu and said in a deep voice. As you can see, I have a regenerative ability. He Zhanghai sneered. He naturally knew what Shenguang was thinking. But so what if he had the ability to regenerate? You know the whereabouts of the Yuan family? The divine light pursed her lips and asked. What do you think? He Zhanghai gave a thought-provoking answer. Divine light was actually not interested in the Yuan family. It just did not want Kang Xinmu to have a grudge with the Yuan family. After all, if they became enemies, Kang Xinmu alone would not be able to contend against the Yuan family. Of course, Kang Xinmu was a member of the Dragon God clan, which was also a famous clan. However, the Yuan family could not be underestimated. The Yuan family was an untouchable existence. Shenguang didn't ask anything else, but he naturally wouldn't back down. He wouldn't let He Zhanghai disturb Kang Xinmu's closed-door training. He Zhanghai had the regenerative ability, which gave him the ability to fight for a long time. For the past year, He Zhanghai had relied on his regenerative ability to survive until now. Moreover, not only did his strength not weaken, but he became even more valiant as he fought. He Zhanghai was no stranger to the Yuan family that Divine Light mentioned. However, this only made him more curious about the Yuan family. The regenerative ability he possessed did indeed come from the Yuan family, but it was not inherited from the Yuan family. Instead, it was inherited from someone else. The person who passed on the regenerative ability to him briefly mentioned the Yuan family and did not mention them again. In the sect, Yuan family was also a taboo word. It's been a year. It's about time for you to go back. He Zhanghai gathered his power and approached the divine light again. Shenguang saw He Zhanghai's expression and reaction just now. He roughly knew that He Zhanghai didn't interact with the Yuan family members and was not very interested in him. Shenguang's strength was beyond He Zhanghai's expectations. He used his own cultivation to pass through the door of the contract and came to this world where he couldn't recover his own ability for as long as a year. However, he had already stayed for a year. It was indeed time for him to go back. Shenguang could clearly feel that the aura around He Zhanghai's body had suddenly become stronger. In the past year, every time He Zhanghai was defeated, his strength would increase. It grew exponentially. Until now, his regenerative ability was getting stronger. Even Moya could feel the strong power around He Zhanghai. All this while, she had been protecting Kang Xinmu. Now that she sensed the aura around He Zhanghai's body, she was shocked. Be careful. Moya's beautiful eyes focused. Her slender jade-like hands quickly formed a seal. With her as the center, the seal spread out in all directions. At this moment, the surrounding space was invaded by waves of white light. He Zhanghai's attack was slightly stagnant. Although the stagnation only lasted for a short while, it didn't weaken. It swept toward Shenguang while heading toward Kang Xinmu. Moya had been paying attention to Kang Xinmu. She stood out immediately, wanting to block the attack for Kang Xinmu. However, the moment she approached, the barrier around her shattered inch by inch. Don't. Shenguang saw this and hurriedly shouted. It was undeniable that Moya's ability to remove negative elements was very strong. However, it wasn't enough to block He Zhanghai's attack. The regenerative ability that he had displayed was a genuine inherited power of the Yuan family. The regenerative ability could regenerate all of one's strength and strengthen it by several times. It could be said to be a very strong auxiliary power. Moya was naturally aware of the strength of He Zhanghai's strength. However, she couldn't ignore Kang Xinmu. As soon as Shenguang said this, he suddenly dashed forward and blocked He Zhanghai's attack personally. However, he also paid a price for this. He Zhanghai sent him back to the Gate of Contract. Being sent back to the Gate of Contract meant that he wouldn't be able to pass through the Gate of Contract for a long time and wouldn't be able to come to this world. He Zhanghai glanced at Emoya coldly. He didn't retract his hand gesture. His target was Kang Shinmu. His power was also locked on to Kang Shinmu. Even if Emoya blocked in front of him, his attack would still avoid Emoya. This space rampart originally had its own rules. However, since a year ago, the rules in the space rampart had been flowing away. Until now, the space rampart was basically not bound by the rules. Without the restrictions of the rules, He Zhanghai's phantom vortex could operate to the maximum. He could control the power to attack whoever he wanted. Even if the attack deviated from its original trajectory, it could still hit the target that he had locked onto. Emoya naturally understood the power of He Zhanghai's phantom vortex. Without the rules of the space rampart, it also lost the most crucial power of the space rampart, binding. He would definitely target all of his attacks on Kang Shinmu. Since that was the case, all of his flaws would be exposed. Emoya's figure dashed forward. She wanted to attack He Zhanghai and weaken his attack. However, just as she was about to move, the space around her solidified layer by layer, forming a prison that trapped her inside. Emoya immediately used a spell to erase the prison's restrictions. She was very fast, and the speed at which the prison solidified was also very fast. After this cycle repeated 3 times, Emoya clearly felt that the prison had become even stronger. If she wanted to remove the prison again, she would have to expend a lot of her soul consciousness. Moreover, before she could remove the prison, it would be restored again. "Miss, I'll have to trouble you for now." He Zhanghai glanced at Emoya. His attack had already reached the front of Kang Shinmu's barrier. With his current power, the result of facing Kang Shinmu's barrier was that Kang Shinmu's barrier was like a piece of paper. It crumbled in an instant. "I was wondering how capable you were." He Zhanghai laughed coldly. Chapter 57-33. Jiang Shenwu's figure was nowhere to be seen behind the inch-by-inch shattered barrier. Moreover, there was not even a trace of Kang Shinmu's aura. Not only in the barrier, but even around the barrier, including the surrounding space, there was no trace of Kang Shinmu's aura. Suddenly, He Zhanghai seemed to have thought of something. His eyes narrowed, and he looked at Emoya. Emoya's figure also suddenly disappeared. What the hell was going on? Ever since the rules in the space barrier disappeared, the phantom vortex was no longer affected. It was no exaggeration to say that no one in the cave mansion could escape his perception when they used spatial techniques. However, at this moment, Kang Shinmu had disappeared into thin air. Not only could he not sense any spatial technique Kang Shinmu used, but he also could not sense when Emoya had left. He Zhanghai calmed his mind and used the phantom vortex technique. In a year's time, his phantom vortex spell had been refined to the large success stage. In just a breath's time, it spread across the entire space of the cave mansion. He Zhanghai did not let go of any corner. He was determined to find Kang Shinmu and Emoya. At this time, in the space not far from He Zhanghai, in front of a stone table in a secret room in the cave mansion, Kang Shinmu put Emoya down. Kang Shinmu? Emoya was a little surprised. When she sensed Kang Shinmu using the technique, she felt that she had passed through layers of space. When the pressure from the space disappeared, she arrived at this place. This secret room was the one where they first found the star map lock. "Senior, I have comprehended the supreme spatial force." Kang Shinmu moved his shackles and said with a smile. He had gained a lot from this heavenly tribulation. Not only did his cultivation base improve, but he had also mastered the supreme spatial force. Supreme spatial force? Emoya was a little surprised. In a year, Kang Shinmu had comprehended the supreme spatial force. Not only was he talented, but he also had a good comprehension ability. Yes, although I've only comprehended part of it, it's not difficult to deal with the spatial barrier. As he spoke, Kang Shinmu glanced in one direction. That was where He Zhanghai was. He Zhanghai's phantom vortex is also a kind of space-type magic art. I had thought that my supreme spatial energy would not be able to contend against it, but now it seems that it can surpass the range of the phantom vortex's perception. Kang Shinmu pondered over the opposites within. Looking at He Zhanghai's posture, he didn't seem to have noticed his departure. Since that was the case, the realm of this supreme spatial energy was not weak. However, even though he had avoided He Zhanghai's senses, he was still unable to leave this space barrier for a while. There were countless spatial barriers in this cave. Later on, they gathered together, causing some changes to the entire cave. Take this secret room for example. It was originally just a secret room with a star map lock. Due to the changes in the space rampart, the space here also changed and gradually became like a space rampart. On the surface, the space rampart was like a barrier, but in reality, it was a kind of conceptual substance. Just like Gufeng's space division, a cultivator could still divide the space layer by layer even when they were in space. This was because space was a conceptual existence. The same went for space ramparts. They were all conceptual existences. It looked like a thin layer of space rampart, but in reality, its thickness was unimaginable. If he wanted to leave this cave, he would have to pass through layers of space ramparts. He Zhanghai was not far from this secret room, but if he wanted to use the phantom vortex to find this place, he would have to pass through layers of space ramparts to lock onto Kang Shinmu and Emoya's traces. Of course, Kang Shinmu knew that he could not leave the cave yet. Moreover, he had to fight He Zhanghai. He had snatched the star map lock, and he had not gotten it back yet. There was one more thing that he could not forget. He Zhanghai coveted Emoya, so he must not let him go. Senior, after I comprehended the supreme spatial energy, I realized that there's something strange about this secret room. Kang Shinmu came to the table in the room. The star map lock had originally been placed on this table. At that time, the star map lock had been enveloped by dermic power, and any cultivator would have stopped in their tracks. Kang Shinmu knew that Tang Xiaoyu had helped him obtain the dermic seal, and he had benefited from Tang Xiaoyu's luck. Successfully comprehending the dermic seal was also a kind of opportunity. He had used the dermic seal to break the dermic power on the star map lock, and the star map lock had been snatched away by He Zhanghai. At that time, Kang Shinmu only cared about chasing after the star map lock, but he had neglected the table with the star map lock. This table was also a type of dermic artifact, and it seemed to be a space-type dermic artifact. The cultivator who had moved this cave out had realized that this table was a dermic artifact, so he had moved it out together with Emoya. Emoya only noticed this table after Kang Shinmu reminded her. She touched the table, and her eyes suddenly lit up. Senior, what's wrong? Kang Shinmu noticed the change in Emoya's expression, and he was a little curious. This seems to be a raw material for refining a space-type dermic artifact. Emoya was very certain. Keep this first, it will definitely be useful in the future. Senior, you're right, but I don't think I can keep this thing. Kang Shinmu tried, but he could not keep it into his space storage bag. Do you understand what to do next? Emoya smiled gently and said. Yes. Kang Shinmu laughed bitterly. He had to get the star map lock back. Speaking of which, he had not been able to contact Ao Tong's puppet ever since he had entered the sealed mystic realm. He had to get the star map lock back as soon as possible. So it's here. At this time, He Zhanghai's phantom whirlpool had finally passed through the layers of space barriers and arrived at this secret room. Although he said it casually, He Zhanghai was very surprised. Kang Shinmu and Emoya were so close to each other, but he did not notice them at all. Especially when Kang Shinmu used his sorcery, the surrounding space did not fluctuate at all. As soon as he finished speaking, He Zhanghai's figure swept over. As soon as he arrived, his eyes fell on the stone table that was placed on the side. With just a glance, He Zhanghai noticed that the stone table was different. Without any hesitation, he put the stone table away. Kang Xinmu and Emoya were stunned. He Zhanghai put the stone table away. He must have a high-level space-type dermic artifact. I thought you would be able to do something after a year of closed-door cultivation. You're just a so-so. He Zhanghai put the stone table away, and he did not forget to insult Kang Xinmu. It's good that you put it away. Saves me the trouble, Kang Xinmu said with a straight face. He Zhanghai was infuriated. He didn't say a word and directly attacked. The aura that leaked out from his body directly blew up the entire secret room. Even the surrounding secret rooms were not spared. The aura was so majestic that even the surrounding space was shattered. Chapter 57-34. The cultivators who came here were all aiming for the Star Atlas Lock. Due to the existence of the magic force, they were unable to obtain the Star Atlas Lock for a while, so they all set out to find a way to break the magic force. Of course, the disciples of the four sects were all aware of the existence of the seal. After knowing about the existence of the magic force, they focused on finding the seal. The only way to break the magic force on the Star Atlas Lock was to find the core of the Star Atlas Lock, which was the seal. A year had passed, but no one had found the seal. At some point in time, a clue regarding the traces of the Dharma seal was revealed. It was said that the people from the Wuxia Pavilion had obtained the seal and broken the magic force. Now, they were going to take the Star Atlas Lock. Recently, all the cultivators who entered this place rushed into the cave abode and passed through layers of space barriers just to find the Star Atlas Lock. He Zhanghai released his power at this time. In the eyes of other cultivators, they only thought that a certain powerhouse had come to fight for the Star Atlas Lock. However, there were some powerhouses who accurately determined He Zhanghai's identity based on his unique aura the moment he released his power. Hence, they all rushed here. The four sects, as the representatives of the powerhouses in the outer region, also played a leading role. Indeed, when everyone saw the people from the four sects heading to the secret room of the cave abode, they followed their footsteps one after another. Although it was impossible to snatch the Star Atlas Lock from the hands of the people from the four sects, following them to see the world might be able to gain some benefits. Among the mixed crowd, there was no lack of the existence of extremely powerful powerhouses. For example, Songyu. Songyu had actually sensed the aura leaked when He Zhanghai and Xinguang fought a long time ago. It was one thing to sense it, but it was really difficult to find the place of the fight. Moreover, Songyu knew He Zhanghai and knew his identity, so she did not intend to have anything to do with He Zhanghai. Recently, she heard that the people from the Wuxia Pavilion obtained the seal, broke the magic force, and took the Star Atlas Lock. Currently, there was only He Zhanghai from the Wuxia Pavilion here, so it was certain that He Zhanghai must have taken the Star Atlas Lock. There were many people who had the same idea as Songyu, but no one wanted to stand out. They all wanted to be the fishermen who took advantage of the situation. Thus, the cultivators who came here first all stayed in one place and observed the situation. The people of the four major sects, including those from the Wuxia Pavilion, arrived one after another. With He Zhanghai making such a scene, Kang Xinmu also had a premonition of what would happen next. When he brought Emoya to this place, he had already circulated the supreme power of space. The supreme spatial energy contained the characteristics of the supreme sacred ice domain, and it could create a new space out of thin air. Although the created space was not suitable for cultivators or other living creatures, it was enough to deal with He Zhanghai. When He Zhanghai appeared, he didn't know that he had already entered the control of Kang Xinmu's supreme spatial force. When He Zhanghai used the illusory vortex again, he finally realized this. Power of space? He Zhanghai still thought that it was just an ordinary power of space, and he didn't think that Kang Xinmu had comprehended the supreme spatial energy. It wasn't that he hadn't fought with Kang Xinmu before, so he was no stranger to the supreme divine power that Kang Xinmu possessed. Kang Xinmu wasn't an ordinary cultivator with twin supreme divine power, but he possessed several types of supreme divine power. For example, the power of the supreme holy land, the supreme soul power, and the evolved power of the supreme divine fire were displayed earlier. Vaguely, there seemed to be a type of supreme divine power. Every supreme cultivator would be able to comprehend the supreme divine power corresponding to their talent power. Before that, they had to step into the supreme divine power. In other words, they had to devour a type of supreme divine power and comprehend the corresponding supreme divine power. At this point, it was basically set. The cultivator had to cultivate the supreme divine power and reach the peak of the supreme divine power. It was also the so-called 9th level of the supreme divine power realm. And the supreme divine power level 9 cultivators would sense the rules corresponding to their talent, and once they stepped into the gate of rules, they would reach the realm of rules. He Zhanghai was in this state now. The supreme divine power level 9 realm. He could clearly sense the situation of Kang Shinmu's supreme divine power. Because of this, his view of Kang Shinmu had changed. He always thought that Kang Shinmu was just lucky, but he didn't expect that Kang Shinmu possessed several types of supreme divine power. Without a strong enough comprehension ability and a strong soul consciousness, it was impossible to control so many supreme divine power at the same time. With Kang Shinmu's strong comprehension ability, it was naturally very normal for him to have a type of power of space. When they really fought, He Zhanghai realized that the space around him wasn't as simple as he thought. Also, Kang Shinmu's supreme divine power seemed strange. No matter what kind of power of space it was, He Zhanghai sealed the surrounding space. To Kang Shinmu, what He Zhanghai was doing now was just the surface strength. After a year's time, his supreme divine power had improved, especially his supreme god spiritual flame, which had been greatly strengthened. Originally, his supreme god spiritual flame had already reached the 8th level. The reason why it was so hard to break through to the 9th level was because some changes had occurred. After this closed-door cultivation, it had reached the 9th level. The strength of the 9th level supreme god spiritual flame far surpassed He Zhanghai's 9th level supreme divine power. Also, at the same time, Kang Shinmu's other supreme divine powers had also greatly strengthened. The only thing that didn't change was probably the supreme divine power of the soul. It seemed that the advancement of the supreme divine power of the soul was inextricably linked to the soul consciousness. Kang Shinmu's soul consciousness was many times stronger than cultivators of the same level. Because his soul consciousness was very strong, it was very difficult for him to continue cultivating. This also caused his supreme divine power of the soul to be unable to improve. Fortunately, he had comprehended the power of space. The strengthening of the soul consciousness, other than the continuous strengthening of one's own cultivation, also needed to be tempered. Only in this way, the strength of the soul consciousness would be strengthened in a practical sense. Of course, there was the possibility that there were some special cultivation methods for the soul consciousness. Supreme cultivators couldn't blindly cultivate this kind of mental cultivation method. Otherwise, it would interfere with the understanding of the supreme domain power. Also, one couldn't be too hasty in cultivation. Being too hasty would often result in irreversible consequences. In short, it was extremely easy for the current Kang Shinmu to deal with He Zhanghai. Especially with the power of space in hand, it was very difficult for He Zhanghai to touch him. Instead, He Zhanghai used the illusory vortex technique to trap himself in space. Supreme Divine Power Level 9 Realm. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.